I am Kendra, 35 years old. The night before Thanksgiving, my own sister called to uninvite me from dinner because my toddler and I did not fit her wealthy white in-laws aesthetic. My mother chimed in to tell me to just order a pizza. I held my 2-year-old's hand, walked out into the freezing rain, and went to a quiet diner where a hostile manager tried to kick us out. That is when an elderly couple in a corner booth intervened. 5 years later, they became our legal family, and at my wedding, what my sister saw made her completely freeze. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to build your own table after your family refused you a seat. I was zipping up my 2-year-old son Malik's duffel bag, double-checking that I had packed enough of his favorite sweet potato puree for tomorrow's Thanksgiving dinner. The oven timer was ticking down on my famous peach cobbler when my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was my sister Jasmine. I put her on speakerphone as I wiped a smudge of flour from my cheek. "Don't bother coming to the house tomorrow," Kendra Jasmine said, her tone sharp and practiced. "Preston's family is flying in from Connecticut. They are old money, and frankly, a single mom with a crying toddler just does not fit the Thanksgiving aesthetic. We don't want your post-divorce drama ruining the vibe." I froze my hand hovering over Malik's bag. Jasmine was 38 and the undisputed golden child of our family. Ever since she married Preston, a white man whose arrogance was only matched by his inherited wealth, she had made it her mission to curate a flawless high society image. I, on the other hand, was the family disappointment. Before I could even process the cruelty of her words, my mother Vivian shouted from the background, "Your sister is trying to impress her white in-laws, Kendra. You dropping out of the Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority legacy line to marry a deadbeat was embarrassing enough for this family's image at church. Do not make this harder than it has to be. Just order a pizza for you and Malik." My mother was a woman who practically breathed for her social standing in our city's elite Black community circles. To her, image was currency, and my recent divorce from a man who had drained our joint accounts had left me bankrupt in more ways than one. My father Calvin, a status-obsessed church deacon, had quietly emptied my college savings to fund Jasmine's lavish $150,000 destination wedding 3 years ago. That betrayal left me to scramble for predatory student loans to finish my finance degree. Now I was working 60-hour weeks at a mid-level wealth management firm, barely scraping by to provide for my son, while my parents rubbed elbows with Preston's country club relatives and pretended I did not exist. "So that is it," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "You are erasing your own daughter and grandson from Thanksgiving because we do not look good enough in photographs." "Oh, stop playing the victim," Jasmine scoffed. "You always do this. You make terrible life choices and expect us to carry the burden. Just stay home, Kendra." I did not beg. I did not cry. I simply pressed the end call button. I looked down at Malik, who was happily clutching his favorite toy train, completely oblivious to the fact that his grandmother and aunt had just discarded us like trash. A familiar cold resolve settled in my chest. I had spent my entire life trying to squeeze myself into a mold that would earn their approval. I was done. I grabbed Malik's little winter coat and slipped his arms into the sleeves. I threw my purse over my shoulder, picked up my beautiful boy, and walked straight out the front door. The November air was biting, and a freezing rain was coming down in heavy sheets, slicking the pavement and chilling me to the bone. I did not have a destination in mind. I just knew I could not sit in that apartment surrounded by the ingredients of a family dinner that would never happen. We walked for a few blocks, the icy rain soaking through my thin wool coat. Malik buried his face in my neck, shivering slightly against the wind. I needed to get him out of the cold. Up ahead, the glowing neon sign of an upscale old-school diner cut through the gloomy downpour. It was a local institution, the kind of place with mahogany booths, dim ambient lighting, and prices that made my current bank account balance weep. But my son was cold and I was exhausted. I pushed through the heavy glass doors, the warmth of the restaurant immediately wrapping around us. The place was relatively quiet, filled with the low hum of jazz music and the clinking of expensive silverware. I stood near the hostess stand, bouncing Malik gently on my hip to keep him calm. The manager, A tall man in a tailored suit approached me. His eyes immediately darted over my rain-soaked coat, my damp hair, and the restless toddler in my arms. His expression hardened into a mask of polite disdain. "Good evening," he said, his tone lacking any actual warmth. "Do you have a reservation? We are currently booking for a private holiday event." "I just need a table for two," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "A booth in the back would be fine. We just want to get out of the rain and get some hot food." Malik chose that exact moment to let out a loud, tired whine, dropping his toy train onto the polished hardwood floor with a sharp clatter. The manager flinched visibly, glancing nervously at the pristine dining room. "I am afraid that will not be possible," he said, stepping slightly forward to block my path. "We maintain a very specific atmosphere here, especially on holiday eves. A young child will disturb the dining experience of our regular patrons. There is a fast food establishment 2 blocks down that might be more accommodating to your situation." The humiliation burned in my throat. First my family, and now this stranger telling me that my son and I were not acceptable, that we did not belong. I bent down to pick up Malik's toy, my hands trembling with suppressed anger and sheer exhaustion. I was about to turn around and walk back out into the freezing rain when a deep, resonant voice cut through the quiet dining room. "The only thing disturbing the atmosphere in this establishment is your profound lack of hospitality, David." The manager whipped around, his face paling instantly. I followed his gaze to a private velvet-lined corner booth. Sitting there was an elegantly dressed elderly African-American couple. The man wore a bespoke charcoal suit, his silver hair perfectly groomed, while his wife possessed the kind of quiet, untouchable grace that radiated absolute power. The manager practically tripped over his own feet as he rushed toward the booth. "Mr. Hughes?" he stammered, his arrogant demeanor instantly vanishing. "I apologize. I was simply explaining our seating policy to the young lady." "You were being incredibly rude," the woman said, her voice smooth but laced with steel. She locked eyes with me and offered a warm, genuine smile. "Bring the young lady and her handsome little boy over to our booth immediately, and bring a high chair." The manager nodded frantically and gestured for me to follow. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, my pride warring with my exhaustion, but the warmth in the elderly woman's eyes made the decision for me. I walked over to the booth, settling Malik into the high chair. The waiter scrambled to provide. "I am so sorry for the intrusion," I said softly, taking off my damp coat. "I am Kendra, and this is Malik. You really did not have to do that." "Nonsense," the man replied, extending a steady hand. "I am Silas Hughes, and this is my wife, Loretta. We were just discussing how awfully quiet this side of the room was. We would be honored if you joined us for dinner." I shook his hand immediately, recognizing the name. Silas and Loretta Hughes were practically local royalty. They were silent billionaires who had built a massive real estate and logistics empire from the ground up during a time when the odds were stacked entirely against them. They were known for their aggressive business acumen and their complete avoidance of flashy social media circles, the exact opposite of my status-obsessed parents. "Thank you," I said, a genuine wave of relief washing over me. "It has been a rather difficult evening." Loretta signaled the waiter with a subtle nod. "Order whatever you like, Kendra. The lamb chops here are exquisite, and Malik looks like he could use some warm macaroni and cheese." As the waiter scurried off to place our orders, Malik happily babbled at Loretta, reaching out a tiny hand toward the sparkling diamond brooch on her lapel. Instead of pulling away, she leaned in, letting him inspect it with a soft chuckle. It was a stark contrast to my own sister, who consistently refused to hold Malik because his sticky hands might ruin her silk blouses. Sitting in that booth, watching these two incredibly powerful strangers treat my son with more dignity and kindness than my own blood relatives had shown him in 2 years, something profound shifted within my spirit. The cold rain outside lashed against the diner windows, but inside I finally felt warm. I had no idea that accepting this dinner invitation would set off a chain of events that would completely dismantle the toxic empire my family had built. I had no idea that in exactly 5 years, the people who had erased me from Thanksgiving would be staring at me in absolute terror as their entire world collapsed at my feet. But that night, All I knew was that I was done waiting for a seat at my family's table. It was time to start building my own. The waiter returned with lightning speed, placing a steaming plate of macaroni and cheese in front of Malik and a beautifully plated rack of lamb in front of me. The manager hovered nervously in the background, clearly terrified of displeasing Silas Hughes. I watched Loretta carefully wipe a spot of cheese from Malik's chin with her pristine linen napkin. She did not flinch or complain about the mess. This simple act of kindness hit me harder than the freezing rain outside. My own mother would have swatted Malik's hand away, terrified he might stain her precious Chanel garments, while Jasmine would have loudly complained that children simply ruined the aesthetic of high-end dining. Just last month, Vivian had physically shoved my son away from her designer bag, screaming that I was raising an undisciplined menace who would embarrass the family. Yet here was a woman worth more money than my parents could ever comprehend, laughing warmly as my toddler babbled at her. Sitting across from Silas and Loretta, I realized true wealth did not need to scream for attention or belittle others to feel powerful. They possessed a quiet, grounded authority that made my parents' country club posturing look like a cheap, desperate school play. We ate in comfortable conversation. Silas asked about my background, and I gave him the brief, sanitized version of my life. I told him I worked at a mid-level wealth management firm downtown, processing low-tier portfolios for clients who barely knew my name. I did not mention the grueling 60-hour weeks or the fact that my paycheck barely covered my rent and Malik's daycare. As the plates were cleared, Silas pulled a pair of reading glasses from his tailored breast pocket and glanced at a financial newspaper resting beside his coffee cup. He tapped a manicured finger against a dense article detailing a complex commercial real estate merger. He sighed, shaking his head with visible frustration. He muttered that his current advisory board was completely missing the mark on a depreciation loophole regarding a massive logistics acquisition his holding company was attempting to finalize. The tax liabilities were threatening to tank a $300 million deal, and his highly paid team of Ivy League consultants were running in circles. I stopped cutting Malik's food. I looked at the headline Silas was reading. The corporate tax structure was something I had spent weeks studying late at night, while Malik slept, desperate to find a way to secure a promotion at my firm. Without thinking, I pointed out that his advisors were likely applying a standard straight-line depreciation model, completely ignoring the cost segregation studies that could massively accelerate depreciation on the property's non-structural assets. I explained that if they reclassified the interior logistics equipment under a 5-year recovery period, rather than 39 years, the upfront tax shield would offset the acquisition costs entirely. Silas lowered his newspaper. He stared at me, his sharp eyes calculating and intense. Loretta paused her conversation with Malik and looked at her husband, a knowing smile playing on her lips. Silas did not offer empty praise. Instead, he challenged me. He fired back a highly technical question about capital gains tax implications during a potential restructuring phase, testing to see if my first answer was a fluke. I did not miss a beat. I broke down the exact IRS section codes, detailing how a complex exchange could defer those capital gains indefinitely if he rolled the profits into a new Opportunity Zone fund. I spoke with the kind of fierce, hungry precision that had terrified my ex-husband and intimidated my male colleagues at the firm. I explained that my father had completely drained my college fund to pay for my sister's lavish destination wedding, desperate to secure his proximity to her white old money in-laws. That betrayal left me to put myself through school with predatory loans. I told them I studied for my financial licensing exams while 8 months pregnant, working night shifts to pay for practice materials because my family refused to help. I knew the tax code better than men who had been handed their degrees because my survival depended on it. Silas leaned back in his leather booth, completely silent for a long moment. He looked at Loretta, then back at me. He told me that his top-tier executives, men pulling 7-figure salaries, had been arguing over that exact problem for 3 agonizing weeks. I had just solved it flawlessly while wiping macaroni off a toddler's face. A sudden, sharp vibration against the mahogany table broke the moment. My phone screen lit up, illuminating the dark wood. The name Preston flashed across the glass. Jasmine's husband. The man whose entire personality was built on inherited wealth and a profound sense of superiority over my family. I tried to ignore it, but the screen buzzed again, displaying a full message preview. I picked up the device, my stomach tightening as I read the text. Heard you could not afford a turkey anyway. I just Venmo'd you $50. Get the kids some nuggets. Enjoy your sad little holiday. My jaw clenched so hard my teeth ached. This was Preston's favorite game. He loved using his money as a weapon to humiliate me, constantly throwing $20 bills at my son like charity while sneering at my tiny apartment and my entry-level job. He and Jasmine fed off my struggle. They needed me to be the broke, miserable single mother so they could feel superior about their own empty, superficial lives. My father, Calvin, had actually encouraged this toxic dynamic. Just yesterday, Calvin had yelled at me to be more grateful for Preston's table scraps, demanding I bow my head to the man who had essentially bought my family's loyalty with his trust fund. Calvin worshipped Preston's money and whiteness, viewing Jasmine's marriage as an elevation of our bloodline, while viewing my existence as a stain on his perfect church deacon image. I stared at the bright screen, the toxic weight of my bloodline pressing down heavily on my chest. I felt a sudden, violent urge to throw the phone across the restaurant. I quickly flipped the phone face down, but I was not fast enough. Loretta had seen it. She was sitting close enough to read the bold text illuminating the screen. I braced myself for the pity. I expected the sympathetic head tilt, the awkward apologies, the gentle patronizing tone that wealthy people often use when confronted with someone else's misery. I prepared myself to politely deflect their concern and retreat back into my protective shell. But Loretta Hughes did not offer pity. Pity was for the weak, and looking into Loretta's eyes, I saw the fierce, unyielding spirit of a woman who had built an empire and suffered fools gladly for no one. Her eyes narrowed into sharp, calculating slits. She looked from my flipped phone to my face, seeing right through the stoic mask I had worn for years. She saw the brilliant, exhausted woman underneath, who was being systematically abused by small-minded, arrogant people. Loretta slowly reached into her designer clutch. The restaurant around us seemed to fall completely silent as she pulled out a solid matte black metal card. It carried no bank logo, no colorful branding, just a sleek, heavy weight of absolute, undeniable power. She slid the cold metal across the polished wood of the booth until it rested directly over my phone, covering Preston's insulting message entirely. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a low, commanding whisper that demanded absolute attention. "Family is not blood, sweetheart," she said, her words slicing through the air with lethal authority. "Family is who holds the umbrella when it rains. You have a phenomenal gift, Kendra. You have a brilliant mind, and you are wasting it on people who actively want to see you fail. Call my private line on Monday morning. Let us change your tax bracket." Monday morning arrived with a biting chill that seeped through my thin wool coat. I pulled my 10-year-old sputtering sedan up to the massive wrought iron gates of the Hughes estate. 2 armed guards checked my identification before the heavy metal gates swung open slowly, revealing a sprawling stone mansion surrounded by acres of manicured, pristine grounds. I parked my outdated car next to a fleet of imported luxury vehicles, grabbed my scuffed briefcase, and walked inside. Loretta and Silas were waiting for me in a vast mahogany library that smelled of aged paper and expensive leather. They did not offer me tea or engage in polite small talk. Silas simply slid a massive, heavy, leather-bound binder across the desk. It landed in front of me with a dull thud. He told me it was the unedited financial profile of a logistics subsidiary his holding company had acquired 2 years ago. The company was bleeding cash, hemorrhaging millions of dollars due to severe supply chain mismanagement and bloated executive salaries. He told me I had exactly 48 hours to find the fatal leak, or I could walk back out the front door and return to my miserable cubicle at the downtown firm. I opened the binder. The numbers were a catastrophic mess, a tangled web of shell corporations and offshore accounts deliberately designed to hide gross incompetence. I did not blink. I simply asked Silas for a quiet room, a calculator, and a pot of black coffee. For the next 6 hours, I buried myself entirely in the financial wreckage. I was meticulously tracing a massive discrepancy in their equipment depreciation schedules when my cell phone shattered the heavy silence of the guest study. The caller ID flashed my father's name, Calvin. I answered the call, keeping my eyes locked on the spreadsheets in front of me. I barely got out a quiet greeting before his booming, authoritative voice filled the room. He did not ask how his grandson Malik was doing. He did not ask what we had eaten for Thanksgiving dinner after being banished from the family home. He immediately launched into a furious, unhinged tirade. He screamed that I was an ungrateful embarrassment to the family name and a stain on his reputation. Preston had apparently complained to him that morning, whining that I never sent a thank you text for the $50 Venmo transfer he had sent me. My father told me I was arrogant, declaring that a divorced woman in my pathetic financial position had absolutely no right to act so proud. He demanded I call Preston immediately, apologize profusely for my terrible attitude, and express my profound, groveling gratitude for his generous charity. If I refused, Calvin threatened to stand at the church pulpit on Sunday morning and ask the entire congregation to pray for my rebellious, broken spirit. He wanted to publicly humiliate me in front of the hundreds of people I had grown up with, all just to appease the fragile ego of his wealthy white son-in-law. I sat in the quiet luxury of the Hughes estate, listening to the man who was supposed to protect me actively try to break me down. I pictured my mother Vivian standing right next to him, nodding along in agreement, terrified that my lack of gratitude might jeopardize their standing with Preston's old money Connecticut relatives. I looked down at the multi-million-dollar financial puzzle resting on the mahogany desk. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I simply told my father that he could not fire me from a job I had already quit. Then I hung up the phone. I turned the device off entirely and shoved it to the very bottom of my purse. That phone call was the final match dropped onto a gasoline-soaked bridge. I used my father's verbal abuse as absolute pure fuel. I did not sleep for the next 2 days. I mapped out every single fraudulent expense, every bloated salary, and every tax inefficiency hiding within the Hughes subsidiary. When I presented my comprehensive restructuring plan to Silas and Loretta on Wednesday morning, Silas actually laughed out loud in pure disbelief. I had not just found the financial leak. I had outlined a ruthless, aggressive strategy to increase the subsidiary's profit margin by a staggering 30% in a single fiscal year. That presentation was the exact beginning of my silent ascension. Silas and Loretta did not just give me a job. They became my ultimate protectors and mentors. I worked 18-hour days fueled by a relentless burning drive to build a fortress so high and so strong that my toxic family could never look down on me again. Within 8 months, I executed the turnaround strategy flawlessly. The logistics company went from bleeding cash to generating record-breaking profits. Silas and Loretta were true to their word. They rewarded my flawless execution by quietly bankrolling my very own boutique wealth management firm. I built my empire completely in the shadows. I deleted all my social media profiles. I changed my phone number. I vanished entirely from the local gossip circles my mother and sister practically lived in. For 3 grueling years, I ground my heels into the corporate floorboards, securing high-net-worth clients who demanded absolute discretion and ruthless financial strategy. My life completely transformed. I moved Malik out of our tiny rundown apartment and into a beautiful penthouse. I hired elite private tutors. I became a complete ghost to my blood relatives, while simultaneously becoming one of the most feared and respected wealth managers in the entire city. My firm's reputation grew strictly through word of mouth among the ultra-wealthy. We were known as the fixers, the people you called when your money was disappearing, and you needed someone absolutely merciless to step in. 3 years later, the freezing rain of that miserable Thanksgiving eviction was a distant memory. I was sitting behind a massive marble desk in my pristine glass-walled corner office on the 40th floor of the city's most exclusive financial high-rise. I was wearing a tailored designer suit, casually reviewing a lucrative acquisition deal when the intercom on my desk buzzed. It was my executive assistant, Sarah. Her voice sounded strained, a mixture of professional annoyance and genuine urgency. She told me there was a woman on line 1 who was practically having a panic attack, demanding to speak directly to the managing partner. Sarah explained that the woman had aggressively bypassed our standard intake protocols, claiming it was an absolute financial emergency, and that she had been given this private number by a desperate country club associate. My firm required a $5 million minimum liquid portfolio just to book a 15-minute consultation, and we rarely took cold calls. I sighed, closed the acquisition file, and told Sarah to patch the caller through, intending to politely redirect them to a junior associate. I picked up the receiver and delivered my standard icy professional greeting. A frantic, breathless voice immediately started rambling on the other end of the line. The caller sounded completely unhinged. She was talking at a mile a minute, rambling about how her husband's investments were mysteriously tanking, how they were facing a massive, terrifying liquidity crisis, and how she desperately needed the ruthless financial shark everyone in her elite circle was whispering about. She said they were bleeding money and could not figure out why their portfolio was suddenly worth a fraction of its previous value. I froze, my hand tightening around the receiver. The voice was absolutely unmistakable. It was high-pitched, intensely entitled, and laced with a level of sheer, unadulterated panic I had never heard from her before. It was Jasmine. My golden child sister was calling my private firm, begging and pleading for a financial bailout, having absolutely no idea that the untouchable, elite corporate shark she was desperately crying to was the exact same single mother she had thrown away like garbage 3 years ago. The voice on the other end of the line was practically vibrating with hysteria. I held the receiver to my ear, leaning back in my ergonomic leather chair, and let the sheer panic wash over me. "Please," Jasmine begged, her breath hitching in that theatrical way she always used when she wanted something. "I was told you are the absolute best in the city. We are facing a complete liquidity crisis. Preston's primary tech investments are plunging and his broker is dodging our calls. We are bleeding capital, and if my father-in-law finds out Preston mismanaged the bridge loan, we are completely ruined. You have to fix this." I took a slow sip of my black coffee, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make her uncomfortable. She had no idea she was pouring her heart out to the sister she had banned from Thanksgiving 3 years ago. She was expecting a nameless, faceless corporate savior. "Jasmine," I said, keeping my tone perfectly flat and devoid of any familial warmth, "you should really tell Preston to stop heavily leveraging bridge loans against volatile tech stocks. It is a rookie mistake." The line went dead silent. I could practically hear the gears grinding in her head as she struggled to process the sound of my voice coming from the private, unlisted number of the city's most ruthless wealth management firm. "Kendra?" She gasped, the panic in her voice instantly evaporating, replaced by a sharp, venomous shock. "What are you doing answering this phone? Put your boss on the line right now. This is a multi-million-dollar emergency, not a receptionist's problem." "I am the managing partner, Jasmine. I own the firm." There was another heavy pause. A normal person would have been embarrassed. A normal person would have felt a shred of humility, realizing the sister they treated like dirt was now the only one who could save them from financial ruin. But Jasmine was not normal. She was a narcissist who had been coddled by my parents for 38 years. The shock lasted exactly 3 seconds before her deep-rooted entitlement completely took over. "Oh," she scoffed, a familiar, condescending sneer returning to her voice. "So you are running some little boutique accounting hustle now. Fine, whatever. This actually works out perfectly. Preston needs his portfolio completely restructured by Friday. I will have him email you the login credentials to his brokerage accounts. Make sure you fix the margin calls first. And do not even think about charging us your ridiculous fee. You owe this family after embarrassing Dad with your messy divorce. That is what little sisters are for." I looked around my corner office, taking in the panoramic views of the city skyline, the custom marble desk, and the framed credentials on my wall. I thought about the 18-hour days, the sleepless nights, and the ruthless strategy I had employed to build this empire from absolutely nothing. I pressed a button on my desk console to initiate the call, recording, a standard practice for all prospective client intake calls. Jasmine, I said, my voice dropping to a glacial chill. Let me make this abundantly clear. My firm requires a $5 million minimum liquid portfolio to even book a 15-minute consultation. From what you just described, Preston's portfolio is heavily leveraged, bleeding cash, and highly illiquid. You cannot afford me. Excuse me? She shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly through the receiver. You listen to me right now. You are going to fix my husband's accounts, or I will have Mom and Dad step in to remind you of your place. I cut the line. I did not slam the phone down. I just pressed a single button, severing the connection and cutting off her entitled demands mid-sentence. I took another sip of my coffee, turned back to my monitor, and resumed reviewing my acquisition file. I knew the fallout would be swift, but I underestimated the sheer audacity of my mother. 2 hours later, I was walking through the expansive glass-walled lobby of my building. I had just finished a highly productive lunch meeting with a venture capitalist and was heading back to the private elevators. The lobby was a masterpiece of modern architecture, filled with imported Italian marble, cascading water features, and security guards stationed at every exit. Suddenly, the heavy glass revolving doors burst open. Vivian marched into the pristine lobby like a hurricane wrapped in fake pearls and a discounted designer trench coat. Her face was contorted in absolute rage. She marched straight toward the main reception desk, her heels clicking aggressively against the marble floor. "Where is she?" Vivian demanded, slamming her hand down on the sleek reception counter. The receptionist, a highly trained professional who usually dealt with international diplomats and tech billionaires, blinked in confusion. "I am sorry, ma'am," the receptionist said politely. "Who are you looking for?" "Kendra." My mother snapped, practically vibrating with fury. "My ungrateful, disrespectful daughter. I just wasted an hour driving to that ghetto, run-down apartment complex she used to live in, only for the landlord to tell me she moved out 3 years ago. I know she works in this building. Call her down here right now. She owes her sister an apology." I stopped walking. I stood near a massive marble pillar, watching the woman who had told me to order a pizza for my toddler on Thanksgiving demand access to my empire. She was causing a massive scene. Several high-profile executives and firm partners had stopped in their tracks, turning to stare at the screaming woman, disrupting the quiet professionalism of the lobby. I could have signaled security to simply remove her. It would have been easy. But I was tired of hiding. I was tired of letting her dictate the terms of our relationship. I stepped out from behind the pillar and walked calmly toward the reception desk. "Mom," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the quiet lobby, "you are disturbing my staff." Vivian whipped around. Her eyes widened as she took in my appearance. I was not wearing the exhausted, defeated expression of the struggling single mother she remembered. I was wearing a bespoke cream-tailored suit, flawless makeup, and a pair of diamond stud earrings Loretta had gifted me for my last birthday. For a fraction of a second, I saw genuine shock register on her face. She looked at the luxurious surroundings, then back at me, her brain struggling to reconcile the daughter she had discarded with the powerful woman standing before her. But just like Jasmine, Vivian's narcissism quickly overrode her logic. Her shock morphed instantly into blazing, self-righteous anger. She stomped toward me, closing the distance between us, completely ignoring the security guards who were now moving in to intercept her. "How dare you!" Vivian hissed, her voice trembling with fury. "Who do you think you are, hanging up on your sister?" Jasmine called me in tears. "Preston is under an immense amount of stress providing for this family, and you have the audacity to deny them a simple financial favor. After everything we have done for you, everything you have done for me." I repeated, my tone dangerously quiet. "You mean emptying my college fund to pay for Jasmine's wedding? You mean allowing my father to threaten me from the pulpit? You mean telling me I was an embarrassment because I refused to stay married to a man who stole from me? You have done absolutely nothing for me, Mom." Vivian's face turned a violent shade of red. In her world, children regardless of their age were subordinates who existed solely to serve the family image. Being spoken to with such calm, unwavering authority by the daughter she deemed worthless was an unforgivable offense. She lost whatever shred of composure she had left. "You ungrateful little brat," she snarled, raising her right hand high into the air. She brought her hand down hard, fully intending to slap me right across the face in the middle of my own corporate lobby. I did not flinch. I did not even blink. I knew exactly who she was. But before her palm could make contact with my cheek, her wrist was caught dead in midair. The impact of the block was so sudden and so forceful that Vivian gasped, stumbling slightly backward. I looked up. Standing directly beside me, his grip firmly locked like a steel vise around my mother's wrist, was Julian. Julian was a devastatingly handsome, sharp-suited African-American corporate attorney. He was one of the most brilliant legal minds in the city, a man I had met through Silas Hughes, and a man who possessed a presence so commanding it sucked the oxygen right out of the room. He was wearing a dark navy suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly, and his expression was a mask of pure, unadulterated ice. He did not release her wrist immediately. He held it just long enough to make his absolute authority clear, his dark eyes boring into Vivian's terrified face. Assaulting the managing partner of a financial firm inside her own building is a Class A misdemeanor. Julian said, his voice a low, lethal baritone that echoed off the marble walls. "I suggest you lower your hand, step away from Kendra, and exit this building before I have my security team press federal charges." Vivian's mouth opened and closed like a fish suffocating on dry land. Julian released her wrist with a look of utter disgust. She stumbled back, clutching her arm, her eyes darting between Julian's towering frame and my unwavering stare. She had come here expecting to bully a subordinate, and instead she had run face first into a fortress she could not breach. Julian did not blink. His posture was rigid, radiating a terrifying calm that made the surrounding security guards pause and step back, recognizing that the situation was already under complete control. He looked down at Vivian, who was still gasping, her face pale with shock, as her wrist remained locked in his unyielding grip. "You are currently trespassing on highly secured commercial property," Julian stated, his voice a smooth, dangerous weapon. "You have attempted to physically assault the managing partner of this firm in front of multiple witnesses and high-definition security cameras. If you do not turn around and walk out of those glass doors immediately, I will not simply have you arrested. I will personally file a civil suit for harassment and corporate disruption, so devastating it will bankrupt whatever retirement accounts you and your husband have left." Vivian's mouth trembled. The arrogant, untouchable matriarch who had dictated my entire existence for decades was suddenly reduced to a trembling, humiliated woman in a discounted trench coat. She yanked her arm back. Julian let her go, stepping slightly in front of me to shield me from her frantic, calculating gaze. She looked around the lobby, realizing that the elite executives and firm partners were not looking at her with respect, but with sheer, unadulterated disgust. Without another word, Vivian spun around and practically ran toward the revolving doors, fleeing the building in absolute disgrace. As the glass doors spun shut behind her, the heavy silence in the lobby broke. People resumed their conversations, pretending nothing had happened. Julian turned to me. The ice completely melted from his dark eyes, replaced by a fierce, undeniable warmth. He gently reached out his thumb, brushing lightly against my cheek where my mother had intended to strike. "Are you all right?" he asked softly, the protective edge in his voice sending a sudden powerful warmth straight through my chest. I looked up into his eyes, feeling the sheer weight of his presence. Over the past 3 years, Julian had been my legal counsel, my sounding board, and my closest confidant. But in this exact moment, standing inches apart in the middle of my corporate lobby, the professional boundaries we had carefully maintained instantly evaporated. I realized he was not just my attorney. He was the partner I had always needed, but never believed existed. I nodded, a genuine smile breaking through my stoic facade, but before I could speak, his cell phone rang, shattering the intimate moment. Julian pulled the phone from his pocket, his expression shifting from warmth back to sharp professionalism as he read the caller ID. It was Silas Hughes's private emergency line. He answered quickly, listening intently for only a few seconds before his jaw tightened. He hung up the phone and looked at me, the urgency clear in his posture. "We need to leave right now," Julian said, his hand resting firmly on the small of my back, to guide me toward the private garage elevators. "Silas had a mild myocardial infarction this morning. Loretta is bringing him back to the estate. They requested both of us immediately." My heart hammered against my ribs as we raced through the city in Julian's car. Silas Hughes was a titan, a man who seemed entirely invincible. The thought of him lying in a hospital bed vulnerable sent a cold spike of fear through my veins. He and Loretta had been more of a family to me in 3 years than my own blood relatives had been in a lifetime. When the heavy wrought iron gates of the Hughes estate swung open, Julian bypassed the visitor parking and drove straight up to the private residential entrance. We walked rapidly through the sprawling mansion, the usual pristine silence feeling heavy and ominous. We found them in Silas's private study. Silas was seated in his massive leather armchair, looking slightly paler than usual, but his eyes were just as sharp and piercing as the night I had first met him at the diner. Loretta stood behind him, her hands resting protectively on his shoulders, projecting the quiet, untouchable grace that anchored their entire empire. I rushed forward, the relief washing over me so intensely my voice shook as I asked how he was feeling. Silas waved a dismissive hand, scoffing at the medical monitors a private nurse was packing away in the corner. "It was a minor flutter," Silas grumbled, adjusting his bespoke suit jacket. "The doctors are overreacting. But it did serve a very specific purpose. It reminded Loretta and me that we have delayed the final phase of our restructuring for far too long." Loretta signaled for the nurse to leave the room. Once the heavy oak doors clicked shut, she walked around the desk and picked up a thick, bound legal portfolio. She handed it to Julian, who opened it, his eyes scanning the documents with rapid precision. I watched Julian's breath hitch slightly, a rare break in his usual impenetrable composure. He looked up at Silas and Loretta, a deep, profound respect settling over his features. "Kendra," Loretta said softly, walking over to stand directly in front of me. "Silas and I built this empire with our bare hands. We fought through rooms filled with people who desperately wanted to see us fail. We accumulated more wealth than any 2 people could ever need, but we were never blessed with children of our own." Silas leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. "When you sat in that diner 3 years ago, exhausted and humiliated, you did not ask for a handout. You asked for a seat at the table. Since then, you have protected our assets with the ferocity of a lion. You treat our legacy not as a stepping stone, but as your own." Loretta reached out and took both of my hands in hers. Her diamond brooch caught the sunlight streaming through the study windows. "We do not want you to simply manage our wealth, Kendra. We want you to inherit it." Julian stepped forward, holding the heavy legal portfolio open. He looked directly into my eyes, his voice thick with emotion. "These are finalized, irrevocable trust documents and adult adoption papers. Silas and Loretta are legally adopting you, Kendra. You and Malik are being named the sole uncontested heirs to the $400 million Hughes holding empire." The room spun. I stared at the documents, then at Silas and Loretta. $400 million. The sheer magnitude of the number was paralyzing, but it was not the money that brought tears to my eyes. It was the word daughter. They were giving me their name, their legacy, and their ultimate protection. They were permanently severing my ties to the toxic bloodline that had tried to bury me. I fell to my knees, wrapping my arms around Loretta's waist, sobbing with a level of pure, unadulterated relief I had never experienced. Silas stood up, ignoring his doctor's orders, and pulled us both into a fierce embrace. For the first time in my 35 years of life, I finally had a family. As I stood up, wiping the tears from my cheeks, I turned to Julian. He was looking at me with an intensity that made the air in the room feel completely electrified. He handed the portfolio to Silas, stepped directly into my space, and did the one thing I never expected. He dropped gracefully to one knee, right there on the Persian rug in the middle of the Hughes study. "Life is entirely too short to waste a single second pretending I do not want you forever," Julian said, his deep voice resonating with absolute certainty. He pulled a velvet box from his jacket pocket, snapping it open to reveal a flawless, brilliant cut diamond ring. "You are the strongest, most brilliant woman I have ever known. Kendra, marry me. Let me stand beside you while you run this empire." I gasped, my hands flying to my mouth. I looked at Silas and Loretta, who were beaming with pure joy. I looked back down at Julian, at the man who had caught my mother's wrist, who had protected my peace, and who understood exactly what it took to build a fortress. I said yes. At that exact moment, the study doors burst open. Malik, now 5 years old, ran into the room wearing his miniature school uniform, completely oblivious to the multi-million-dollar legacy that had just been secured in his name. Julian scooped him up into his arms, spinning him around while the entire room filled with genuine, unbridled laughter. It was the perfect moment. But perfection breeds envy, and my biological family was incapable of leaving perfection alone. 3 weeks later, the news of my engagement leaked. I had kept the adoption and the $400 million inheritance strictly confidential, completely buried under airtight non-disclosure agreements. But I could not hide the massive diamond on my left hand, and the elite circles of the city's black society were small. Through a tangled web of country club rumors and Sunday morning gossip, word reached my father's church. Calvin was standing in the church vestibule counting the morning offering when Deacon Willis casually mentioned that he had seen Calvin's estranged daughter dining at the city's most exclusive country club, wearing an engagement ring the size of a boulder. The deacon enthusiastically added that Kendra was apparently marrying Julian, a highly successful, exceptionally wealthy corporate attorney known for his massive real estate acquisitions. Calvin froze, his fingers tightening around the stack of collection envelopes. He did not care that I was happy. He did not care that I was safe. All his mind registered was the phrase "highly successful corporate attorney." Calvin immediately walked out of the vestibule, locked himself in his office, and pulled out his cell phone. He dialed Jasmine's number, his mind racing with greedy, manipulative calculations. Jasmine answered, her voice tired and strained from Preston's ongoing financial disaster. Calvin did not waste time with pleasantries. He told her exactly what he had heard. He told her that her worthless younger sister had somehow managed to trap a rich, powerful lawyer. Calvin paced the floor of his church office, a sinister smile creeping onto his face. He told Jasmine that this was the answer to all their prayers. If Kendra was marrying into money, they could force their way back into her life. They could use familial guilt and religious manipulation to hijack the wedding demand and invite and bleed Julian dry to bail Preston out of his catastrophic debts. Calvin told his golden child to dry her tears. They were going to plan a family reunion, and they were going to make sure Kendra paid the ultimate price for her seat at the table. The sweeping glass atrium of the Sterling Conservatory offered a panoramic view of the Pacific Ocean, the perfect backdrop for the quiet, elegant wedding Julian and I were planning. I was reviewing a silk linen swatch with the venue's elite event coordinator, while Julian stood a few feet away, quietly speaking in rapid, fluent French to the estate's executive chef. For the first time in my life, I was breathing easily, entirely focused on building a future, rooted in genuine love rather than toxic obligation. That fragile peace shattered the moment the heavy mahogany doors of the conservatory swung open. Vivian marched into the grand atrium, her heels clicking against the polished terrazzo floor like a metronome counting down to a disaster. Close behind her was Jasmine, wearing an overtly flashy designer dress that practically screamed for attention, and Preston, who trailed them with his signature look of bored, unearned superiority. I felt my spine instantly turn to steel. I had not spoken to my mother or sister since the day Julian intercepted Vivian's hand in my lobby. Yet here they were invading a private closed-door venue tour that was booked under a highly secure non-disclosure agreement. Calvin's invasive church gossip network had clearly worked overtime to track my movements. Before I could even instruct the venue coordinator to call security, Vivian was already barking orders. "Change these floral arrangements immediately," Vivian commanded, snatching the silk swatches right out of the coordinator's hands. "White roses are far too pedestrian. We need cascading orchids. Preston's family from Connecticut will be flying in, and we absolutely must maintain our social standing. They expect a certain tier of elegance, not this minimalist, budget-conscious aesthetic." I stared at her, completely stunned by the sheer, unadulterated audacity. She was attempting to hijack my wedding to impress the in-laws of the sister who had explicitly banned my child from Thanksgiving dinner. Jasmine did not miss a beat, stepping right into my personal space with a sickly sweet, entirely manufactured smile. She reached out and aggressively grabbed my left hand, pulling it up to examine the ring Julian had slipped onto my finger 3 weeks ago. Her eyes darted over the stone, and I watched her lips curl into a patronizing sneer. "Oh, Kendra, it is so cute," Jasmine cooed, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "It is so smart of your new lawyer friend to be practical. Moissanite is very trendy right now for second marriages, and lab-grown stones are perfect for single mothers on a budget. Nobody will even be able to tell it isn't real unless they look closely. Preston and I were actually just saying we should set up a little honeymoon fund for you two. We know how hard it is to start over." I looked down at my hand. The ring resting on my finger was not moissanite. It was a flawless D-color 4-carat estate diamond, pulled directly from Loretta Hughes's private, heavily guarded vault. It possessed a clarity and fire that Jasmine's commercially bought, heavily financed engagement ring could never even dream of matching. I slowly pulled my hand out of her grasp. I did not correct her. I had learned from Silas and Loretta that true power never needs to explain itself to clowns. Julian, having finished his conversation with the chef, smoothly closed the distance between us. He placed a warm, protective hand on the small of my back, his dark eyes sweeping over my uninvited family with calculating absolute precision. Preston immediately zeroed in on Julian. In Preston's narrow, status-obsessed worldview, a successful black man in a bespoke Tom Ford suit was not a person to be respected. He was simply an asset to be exploited. Preston smelled money, and given the frantic state of his hemorrhaging investment portfolio, he smelled a lifeline. "Julian, right?" Preston said, stepping forward with an aggressive, overly familiar swagger. He completely bypassed a handshake and clapped Julian forcefully on the shoulder. "Jasmine tells me you are swimming in the corporate law lane. That is solid, but you know as well as I do that the real generational wealth is in commercial development. I am putting together a ground floor syndicate right now. High-yield, massive returns completely insulated from market volatility. I usually only bring in my Connecticut circle, but since you are marrying into the family, I am willing to let you in on the ground floor." I felt my blood turn to ice. Preston was attempting to pitch a predatory investment scheme to a man whose current daily operations involved managing a $400 million holding empire. Julian did not shrug Preston's hand off his shoulder. He did not lose his composure. Instead, he smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the precise, chilling smile of an apex predator watching a mouse willingly lock itself inside a cage. "Is that so?" Julian asked, his voice smooth and deceptively polite. "A high-yield commercial syndicate. And what is your primary strategy for mitigating the current regulatory shifts in opportunity zone capital gains?" Preston blinked, clearly caught off guard. He stammered, throwing out a chaotic word salad of financial buzzwords that meant absolutely nothing. He mumbled something about synergy, aggressive portfolio leveraging, and proprietary market disruption. It was a pathetic, transparent display of profound financial illiteracy. Julian listened patiently, nodding as if Preston were imparting profound wisdom. When Preston finally finished rambling, Julian smoothly reached out his hand. "Fascinating strategy," Julian said smoothly. "Do you have a card?" Preston's chest puffed out with arrogant triumph. He shot a smug, victorious look at Jasmine, fully believing he had just hooked a massive, wealthy fish to save his sinking ship. He pulled a thick, embossed business card from his jacket and slapped it into Julian's palm. "Call my direct line," Preston boasted. "Let us get your capital working for you." "We will definitely be in touch," Julian replied, slipping the card into his tailored breast pocket. "Now, if you will excuse us, Kendra and I have a private tasting to attend. The venue security will escort you to your vehicles." Before Vivian or Jasmine could launch another verbal assault, two towering security guards materialized from the shadows of the conservatory, stepping firmly between us and my family. The sheer physical presence of the guards forced Vivian, Jasmine, and Preston to back away, their loud, indignant protests echoing off the glass walls as they were unceremoniously marched out of the building. Later that night, the city lights reflected against the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse. Malik was sound asleep in his room, completely unaware of the absolute war raging outside our walls. I was sitting on the plush living room sofa, nursing a glass of red wine, my mind still reeling from the sheer toxicity of the afternoon's ambush. Julian was sitting at the marble kitchen island. Only the glow of his laptop screen illuminated the sharp, focused angles of his face. He had been working in total, unbroken silence for nearly 2 hours. "Kendra, come here," Julian said, his voice dropping to a low, serious register that immediately grabbed my attention. I set my wine glass down and walked over to the island, standing behind his chair. He reached into his jacket, pulled out the embossed business card Preston had handed him that afternoon, and tossed it onto the marble counter. Then he tapped a key on his laptop, bringing up a heavily encrypted, highly classified federal database. I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the dense lines of text on the screen. It was not a standard corporate background check. The document bore the official seal of the United States Department of Justice. "Your brother-in-law is not just an arrogant, incompetent investor," Julian said softly, his eyes locked on the glowing text. "His entire firm is a massive, highly coordinated Ponzi scheme. He has been systematically targeting and draining the retirement funds of minority-owned businesses across the state to prop up his own failing investments." I stared at the screen, the breath completely leaving my lungs. The files detailed millions of dollars in fabricated returns, phantom real estate developments, and wire fraud. It was a catastrophic, undeniable house of cards, and it was about to collapse with nuclear force. I looked down at Julian, my mind racing. "How do you have access to this?" Julian leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. His eyes met mine, utterly devoid of any mercy. "Before I took over as chief counsel for Silas and Loretta, I spent 6 years as a federal prosecutor for the Securities and Exchange Commission," Julian stated, his voice a lethal, quiet calm. "I still consult on high-level financial crime task forces. My former division has been tracking this specific syndicate for 9 months. He reached out, tapping a manicured finger directly on Preston's name at the top of the federal indictment file. They just needed one final piece of evidence to prove he was actively soliciting new capital to hide the fraud. Julian continued, picking up the business card Preston had so arrogantly handed him. "Handing this to me today was the final nail in his coffin. I am the lead special prosecutor, building the federal indictment against him. By this time next week, Preston is going to a federal penitentiary, and everything your sister owns will be seized by the government." The Waverly Country Club was an impenetrable fortress of old money, a sprawling estate nestled along the coastline where membership could not simply be bought, it had to be inherited. The grand terrace overlooked the crashing waves of the Pacific, bathed in the soft golden light of the late afternoon. Crystal flutes clinked, a string quartet played a flawless rendition of Vivaldi, and 50 of the most powerful women in the city mingled under canopies of imported white orchids. Loretta had spared absolutely no expense for my bridal shower. She had orchestrated an afternoon of unparalleled elegance, surrounding me with female senators, tech billionaires, and philanthropic titans. For the first time in my life, I was being celebrated not for what I could do for someone else, but simply for who I was. I stood near the edge of the terrace, wearing a custom-tailored ivory silk jumpsuit, holding a glass of vintage champagne, and finally allowing myself to breathe. I was safe. I was protected. I was home. That fragile, beautiful peace shattered the moment the heavy brass doors of the terrace violently swung open. The string quartet faltered, a sharp, dissonant scrape of a cello bow echoing across the patio as every head turned toward the entrance. Vivian and Jasmine marched onto the pristine terrace like a pair of invading scavengers. They had clearly bluffed their way past the front gate by dropping Calvin's title, exploiting his connections with a few of the more prominent church-going members of the club. Vivian wore a garish, overly sequined dress that belonged at a discount pageant, while Jasmine was stuffed into a skin-tight designer knockoff, loudly clicking her heels against the imported stone. They looked utterly and completely out of place. A glaring display of desperate performative wealth crashing into a room of quiet, unquestionable power. Well, look who finally decided to play dress-up. Jasmine's voice pierced the elegant hum of the terrace, loud and intentionally grating. The conversation around us died instantly. 50 pairs of highly influential eyes locked onto my biological mother and sister. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach, but I did not step back. I placed my champagne flute on a passing waiter's silver tray and stood my ground. Jasmine closed the distance between us, her eyes darting greedily around the luxurious setting before locking onto me with a venomous glare. She intentionally raised her voice, ensuring her words carried to the ears of every billionaire wife and politician on the terrace. "It is just so inspiring," Jasmine announced, projecting her voice with theatrical cruelty. "To see how far you have climbed. I mean, just a few years ago, you were crying on mom's couch, a struggling single mother, begging for grocery money because your first husband left you with absolutely nothing. And now look at you. You managed to sink your claws into a rich lawyer, and suddenly you are playing society housewife. It really is a modern-day Cinderella story, from welfare lines to country clubs." A collective icy intake of breath rippled through the guests. Vivian stood right behind Jasmine, her chin raised in arrogant agreement, completely oblivious to the fact that the women around them were not looking at me with pity. They were looking at Vivian and Jasmine with sheer, unadulterated disgust. But Jasmine was not finished. The toxic narcissism fueling her entire existence required her to not just humiliate me, but to elevate herself. She flipped her hair over her shoulder, placing a hand on her hip to show off the oversized, heavily financed diamond on her own finger. "Of course, some of us do not have to rely on pity proposals," Jasmine continued, her tone laced with a sickening elitist pride. "I actually married into a real legacy. Preston's family came over on the Mayflower. It takes that kind of pure generational Connecticut breeding to elevate a family like ours. You have to bring in proper high-class white stock to lighten up the family tree and fix the pedigree. But I suppose a glorified charity case like you has to take whatever handouts you can get from these people." The sheer, unapologetic racism and classist self-hatred in her statement hung in the air like toxic smoke. It was a vile, deeply offensive display of colorism and internalized desperation. She actually believed that marrying a mediocre, financially illiterate white man elevated her bloodline. She believed it made her superior. Before I could even open my mouth to respond to the utter depravity of her words, the crowd of women parted seamlessly. Loretta Hughes glided forward. She did not rush. She did not raise her voice. She moved with the lethal, fluid grace of a queen, stepping onto a battlefield she had already conquered. She wore a simple, flawless emerald green gown, her posture radiating an authority so absolute that both Vivian and Jasmine instinctively took a step backward as she approached. Loretta stopped directly in front of Jasmine. She looked at my sister from head to toe, her gaze cool, analytical, and entirely merciless. "That Birkin bag you are clutching so desperately to your side is a remarkably poor counterfeit," Loretta stated. Her voice was not a shout, but a low conversational murmur that carried perfectly in the dead silent space. "The blind stamp is entirely the wrong font. The stitching is uneven, and the palladium hardware is already oxidizing. It is a cheap, fraudulent imitation trying desperately to pass itself off as something of value." Loretta slowly shifted her gaze from the fake handbag up to Jasmine's terrified face. "Much like your husband's investment portfolio," Loretta added, her voice dropping to a glacial chill. Jasmine physically recoiled, the color draining entirely from her face. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Loretta's casual, surgical reference to Preston's fraudulent finances struck like a physical blow. Vivian immediately stepped forward, her face twisting into indignant rage, attempting to shield her golden child. "How dare you speak to my daughter that way?" Vivian spat, pointing a shaking finger at Loretta. "You have no idea who we are. We are her real family. We raised her." Loretta slowly turned her attention to Vivian. The temperature on the terrace seemed to plummet 20 degrees. "You gave birth to her?" Vivian, Loretta corrected smoothly. "But you certainly did not raise her. You merely survived her. You raised your other daughter to be an empty, sycophantic ornament for a mediocre man's fragile ego. You raised her to believe that her proximity to whiteness and stolen wealth somehow validates her existence. You taught her to worship the illusion of power. Loretta took a single step closer to Vivian, invading her space, her dark eyes blazing with an untouchable, terrifying maternal fury. But I raised Kendra to own the building, Loretta stated quietly. I taught her how to hold the deed. Vivian opened her mouth, her chest heaving with outrage, but the words completely failed her. She was entirely out of her depth, drowning in a sea of actual power she could not comprehend, let alone manipulate. Loretta did not wait for a response. She turned her back on Vivian and Jasmine with absolute dismissive finality. She reached out and took my hand in hers, turning to face the 50 elite women gathered on the terrace. "Ladies," Loretta announced, her voice ringing out clear and proud across the Pacific breeze. "I apologize for the unpleasant interruption. It seems the club's security protocols need to be thoroughly reviewed. But since the topic of family and legacy has been so loudly introduced, I believe it is the perfect time to make our formal announcement." Loretta smiled at me, her eyes shining with genuine, profound love, before turning back to the crowd. "Silas and I have spent our entire lives building the Hughes-holding empire," Loretta declared. "And for years we searched for someone worthy of carrying that legacy forward. We did not find an employee. We found a daughter. As of yesterday morning, the adult adoption papers have been finalized by the federal courts." The silence on the terrace was absolute. I could hear the faint, rapid sound of Jasmine's ragged breathing behind me. "Kendra is not a charity case," Loretta continued, her voice echoing with undeniable authority. "She is Kendra Hughes. She is my legally adopted daughter, and she is the sole uncontested heir to a $400 million estate. She answers to no one, and she bows to absolutely no one." A collective delighted gasp went through the crowd of women, immediately followed by the sound of genuine rapturous applause. Senators raised their glasses. Billionaire executives smiled with profound approval. I looked over my shoulder. Vivian and Jasmine looked as though they had just been struck by lightning. Their faces were ashen, their eyes wide with a horrific, paralyzing comprehension. $400 million. The number was so vast, so completely outside the realm of their pathetic social climbing comprehension, that it literally broke their brains. The realization that the daughter they had abused, discarded and treated like a worthless burden, now possessed a level of wealth and power that could buy and sell their entire existence 1,000 times over, left them completely, utterly mute. Two heavily armed, immaculately dressed country club security guards stepped onto the terrace. They did not ask Vivian and Jasmine to leave. They simply flanked them, placing firm hands on their elbows, and began marching them toward the exit. Jasmine stumbled in her cheap heels, her fake designer bag banging against her hip, as she was physically removed from the premises. Vivian looked back at me one last time, her eyes filled with a toxic mixture of profound terror and devastating humiliation. I did not blink. I did not smile. I simply raised my glass of vintage champagne and took a slow, deliberate sip as the brass doors swung shut, locking them out of my world forever. The applause swelled again, and the string quartet immediately resumed playing the music, washing away the last lingering stain of my biological family's presence. Loretta squeezed my hand, leaning in to kiss my cheek. "You handled that perfectly," my daughter Loretta whispered. The rest of the shower was a flawless, joyful celebration. For the next 3 hours, I was surrounded by women who offered genuine advice, laughter, and support. But the reality of my bloodline's relentless toxicity was never far away. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon and the guests began to depart to their waiting black cars, I retrieved my phone from my purse. The screen lit up instantly, displaying a single ominous notification. It was a text message from Calvin. I unlocked the screen, standing alone near the edge of the terrace, as the cool ocean breeze swept over me. The message was short, devoid of any fatherly affection, radiating the cold, calculating fury of a narcissist who realized he had just permanently lost access to the greatest asset he never knew he had. "You just declared war on your own blood," the text read. "Watch your back. The glowing screen of my phone felt like ice against my palm as I read Calvin's text message. "You just declared war on your own blood. Watch your back." I stared at the words for several long seconds, waiting for the familiar knot of anxiety to twist in my stomach, waiting for the childhood terror of my father's wrath to paralyze me. But the fear never came. Instead, a profound glacial calm settled over my entire body. I deleted the message, slipped my phone back into my silk clutch, and turned my attention back to the warmth of the room around me. It was the night before my wedding. The rehearsal dinner was being held in the private subterranean wine cellar of a historic downtown hotel, a magnificent space constructed from exposed brick and illuminated entirely by hundreds of flickering pillar candles. The atmosphere was a masterpiece of joy and quiet luxury. Silas and Loretta were seated at the head of the long mahogany table, laughing easily, as Julian stood beside my chair, his hand resting securely on my shoulder, while he delivered a brilliant, heartfelt toast to our chosen family. There were no strained performances here, no desperate attempts to impress anyone. Everyone in the room was already at the absolute pinnacle of their respective worlds. They did not need to pretend, and neither did I. As the catering staff began clearing the dessert plates, I leaned over and quietly excused myself, whispering to Julian that I needed to step into the bridal lounge to touch up my makeup. He kissed my forehead, his dark eyes warm and entirely focused on me, and promised to wrap up his conversation with the event coordinator by the time I returned. I walked down the quiet, carpeted hallway, leading away from the main dining room, the heavy oak doors muffling the sounds of laughter and clinking crystal behind me. I reached for the brass handle of the private bridal lounge, pushing the door open to reveal a room softly lit by wall sconces. I stepped inside and immediately stopped dead in my tracks. The door slammed shut behind me, the heavy deadbolt clicking into place with a sharp, metallic thud. Calvin stood blocking the exit. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under a poorly fitted suit jacket, his clerical collar sitting slightly askew against his neck. The polished, charismatic pastor who commanded an audience of thousands every Sunday was entirely gone. The man standing between me and the door looked frantic, unhinged, and dangerously desperate. His eyes darted around the room before locking onto me with a suffocating, aggressive intensity. "You ignored my texts." Calvin snapped, his voice a harsh, demanding hiss that completely shattered the tranquility of the evening. "You ignored my calls. Did you honestly think you could just lock us out and play house with these billionaires without dealing with your real family first?" I did not flinch. I slowly placed my clutch on the marble vanity, turning to face the man who had spent 3 decades treating my existence as a burdensome afterthought. "You are trespassing on a privately booked floor, Calvin," I stated, my voice devoid of any emotion. "The security detail outside this hall answers directly to Julian. If you do not unlock that door and walk away immediately, you will be escorted out in handcuffs." Calvin scoffed, taking a menacing step forward into my personal space. He reached inside his jacket and pulled out a thick, legal-sized manila folder, throwing it forcefully onto the vanity beside my bag. It hit the marble with a heavy slap. "We do not have time for your arrogant little power trips tonight, Kendra." Calvin growled, the veins in his neck bulging against his collar. "Your sister is at home right now, having a complete nervous breakdown. Vivian has been sedated just to stop hyperventilating. That little stunt your new mother pulled at the country club today set off a chain reaction. Preston's investors are pulling their capital. He is completely leveraged, entirely bankrupt, and on the verge of absolute ruin. His creditors are demanding payment by Monday morning, or they are foreclosing on his house, his cars, and everything Jasmine owns." I looked down at the manila folder, then back up to Calvin, keeping my expression perfectly blank. "And how exactly does Preston's catastrophic financial incompetence involve me?" Calvin's face twisted into a mask of pure, ugly entitlement. He tapped the folder aggressively with his index finger. "Inside that folder is a legally binding corporate authorization drafted for your wealth management firm," Calvin commanded, puffing his chest out to utilize his booming, authoritative pulpit voice. "It is a direct transfer order for a $500,000 family bridge loan. It requires your signature as the managing partner. You have access to $400 million now, Kendra. $500,000 is pocket change to you and your new in-laws. You are going to sign this document right now, authorize the wire transfer for Monday morning, and save your sister's marriage. I stared at him, letting the absolute absurdity of his demand hang in the silence of the room. He had broken into my private rehearsal dinner, trapped me in a room, and was aggressively attempting to extort $500,000 from my firm to bail out the very people who had spent my entire life trying to destroy me. I did not yell, I did not cry, I simply let out a low, dark laugh. The sound of my laughter seemed to shock him more than a physical blow. Calvin recoiled, his eyes widening as I picked up the manila folder and dropped it straight into the metal trash can next to the vanity. "You must have lost your mind," I said softly, my voice laced with pure ice. I would not authorize 50 cents to save Preston from the consequences of his own monumental stupidity, let alone $500,000. Calvin lost whatever fragile grip he had on his sanity. His face turned a violent shade of purple, his hands curling into tight fists at his sides. He stepped so close to me I could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "You selfish, ungrateful little brat!" Calvin roared, completely abandoning any pretense of paternal restraint. "You will sign that paper. You owe this family. You owe Jasmine. Do you have any idea what it took to get her into those elite Connecticut circles? Do you know what it cost to get her into the rooms where she could finally secure a man with a pedigree like Preston?" He leaned in, his eyes blazing with a toxic racist fury that he had hidden behind his pulpit for decades. "I emptied your college fund!" Calvin screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "I took every single dime of your tuition money because Jasmine needed to look the part. She needed the designer clothes, the country club memberships, and the elite social access to secure a high-status, wealthy white husband. She was the one who was supposed to elevate this family's bloodline. She was the one who was supposed to bring us real power. I sacrificed your entire future so she could win the ultimate prize, and you owe this family for your life." The confession hit the air like a physical shockwave. He had finally said it out loud. The mystery of my vanished college tuition, the financial struggles that had forced me to work 2 jobs just to survive community college, the systemic sabotage of my entire young adult life. It had all been a calculated, deliberate theft to fund Jasmine's pathetic, desperate attempt to buy her way into a society that ultimately viewed her as a joke. I looked at Calvin, the man who was supposed to protect me, and realized he was nothing but a pathetic, self-hating coward. "You stole my future to buy Jasmine a counterfeit life," I said, my voice completely steady, radiating a lethal calm. "And she did not even catch a prize, Calvin. She caught a con artist." Calvin blinked, the aggressive momentum suddenly draining from his posture. "What are you talking about?" I crossed my arms over my chest, stepping forward to force him backward. "I am not signing your loan document because $500,000 cannot save a man who is actively being hunted by the federal government," I stated clearly, watching his face contort with confusion. "Preston is not just bankrupt, Dad. His entire real estate portfolio is a Ponzi scheme targeting minority-owned businesses. He has been defrauding investors for years." Calvin's mouth fell open, his hands shaking as the reality of my words began to penetrate his thick skull. "And my fiancé," I continued, my voice dropping to a terrifying whisper, "is not just a corporate lawyer. Julian is the lead special prosecutor for the Securities and Exchange Commission Task Force, building the federal indictment against him. By next week, Preston is going to a federal penitentiary, and everything Jasmine owns will be seized by the United States government." Calvin stumbled backward as if I had shoved him. His breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. The illusion of his golden child's superiority was completely shattered, replaced by the impending horror of a massive, extremely public federal scandal that would undoubtedly drag his church and his reputation down with it. But a narcissist never surrenders even when the ship is already at the bottom of the ocean. Calvin's shock quickly mutated into a vicious, spiteful, cornered rage. "You think you have won," Calvin hissed, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face. "You think you can just discard us and walk down the aisle tomorrow like royalty. I am the pastor of the largest congregation in this city. I hold the social capital in this community, Kendra. If you do not help us right now, I will boycott your wedding. I will pull every single guest, every family member, and every church official. I will make sure your side of the aisle is completely humiliatingly empty. I will embarrass you in front of the Hughes family and your arrogant lawyer. You will walk down that aisle completely alone, looking exactly like the abandoned, unwanted orphan you actually are." He stood there panting, fully believing he had just played a masterful, devastating hand. He thought the threat of public isolation would break me. He thought the fear of looking unloved in front of Julian's elite family would force me to submit to his extortion. I looked at my father, and a slow, cold smile spread across my face. I did not feel fear. I felt the absolute, undeniable power of a woman who already held all the cards. "Don't worry, Dad," I said softly, my eyes locking onto his with chilling certainty. "You are going to want to be there tomorrow." Calvin stared at me, deeply unsettled by my complete lack of panic. He practically ripped the deadbolt open, yanking the door wide. "Tomorrow will be your ultimate disgrace," Calvin promised, his voice trembling with venom before he spun around and stormed down the hallway, disappearing into the shadows. I stood alone in the quiet room for a moment, listening to the faint sound of laughter returning from the dining hall. I smoothed the fabric of my dress, picked up my clutch from the marble vanity, and walked back out to join my real family, counting down the hours until the sun came up. The morning of the wedding arrived with brilliant, cloudless skies, a sharp, beautiful contrast to the suffocating toxicity my biological family was brewing in their least luxury sedan. Calvin gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, his jaw set in a rigid line of righteous indignation. He had spent the entire night fuming over my absolute refusal to sign away $500,000 to save Preston from federal ruin. In Calvin's mind, today was not a celebration of my future. It was the battleground where he would finally break my spirit, publicly humiliate me, and force me back into submission. Vivian sat in the passenger seat, aggressively adjusting a string of faux pearls that she had paired with an overly structured, outdated mother-of-the-bride dress. She was already practicing her condescending smiles, ready to play the role of the long-suffering matriarch, forced to attend a pathetic, budget-conscious affair. In the back seat, Jasmine was a walking disaster of desperate insecurity. She had specifically chosen a skin-tight, heavily beaded gown in a shade of champagne that bordered dangerously on bridal white. The dress was entirely inappropriate for a daytime ceremony, plunging at the neckline and covered in cheap sequins that caught the light in all the wrong ways. She was determined to upstage me. Preston sat beside her, sweating profusely into the collar of his suit. He was completely unaware that Julian held his federal indictment, but the impending collapse of his Ponzi scheme had him twitching with nervous, frantic energy. "Are you absolutely sure you want to go through with this, Calvin?" Vivian asked, her voice laced with venom. "We could simply turn the car around right now, let her walk down the aisle to an empty side of the room. It would serve her right for disrespecting this family." Calvin sneered, turning the steering wheel sharply. "No, we are going. I want to see the look on her face when she realizes her pathetic little wedding is a complete joke. I am going to stand up in the middle of that ceremony and remind her exactly who she belongs to. She thinks marrying some lawyer gives her power. Wait until I pull every single church member out of that reception. We are going to leave her crying in an empty hall." Jasmine laughed loudly from the back seat. "I cannot wait to see the cheap catering hall they booked. Probably some dark, outdated hotel basement. Preston, make sure you bring your business cards. Her new husband's little lawyer friends might be desperate enough to invest in your new fund." The GPS on Calvin's phone chimed, instructing him to turn off the main highway onto a private, heavily wooded coastal road. Calvin frowned, slowing the car down. The dense canopy of ancient oak trees gave way to a towering, 10-foot-high wrought iron gate flanked by pristine stone pillars. "This cannot be the right address," Calvin muttered, stopping the car in confusion. But it was. The gilded lettering on the stone pillar read, "The Hughes Estate." As Calvin pulled the leased sedan forward, 3 towering security guards wearing dark suits and tactical earpieces stepped out to intercept them. Calvin rolled down his window immediately, puffing out his chest to project his booming pastoral authority. "I am Reverend Calvin, the father of the bride," Calvin announced, expecting the guards to immediately defer to him. "Open the gates." The lead security guard did not even blink. He held a sleek tablet, his expression completely blank and unaffected by Calvin's posturing. He tapped the screen twice. "You are listed under general admission," the guard stated, his voice a flat, uncompromising wall of authority. "Proceed up the driveway to the valet. Do not deviate from the marked path." The massive iron gates slowly swung open, revealing a property that instantly completely shattered their arrogant expectations. The Hughes estate was a $30 million masterpiece of historic architecture, sitting on 10 acres of flawless, manicured coastal cliffs overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Cascading fountains lined the sweeping driveway, and the air was filled with the scent of imported white orchids that draped elegantly from the balconies. Calvin's jaw dropped. Vivian's hand flew to her faux pearls, her eyes widening in absolute shock. Jasmine pressed her face against the car window, her mouth hanging open as the sheer, suffocating magnitude of the wealth before them registered in her brain. This was not a cheap catering hall. This was a fortress of generational power. As they pulled up to the grand entrance, the humiliation compounded. A fleet of valets in pristine white jackets was busy maneuvering a line of vehicles that made Preston's leased car look like a salvaged wreck. There were custom Rolls-Royces, armored Maybachs, and limited edition Ferraris. Preston swallowed hard, shrinking into his seat as a valet opened his door with a look of practiced, polite indifference. The family stepped out of the car completely disoriented and instantly intimidated. The grand foyer of the estate was buzzing with the quiet, refined energy of the city's absolute elite. Waitstaff in formal attire glided through the crowd carrying silver trays of vintage champagne and caviar. Calvin immediately scanned the room, desperately looking for familiar faces from his congregation so he could begin staging his grand boycott. His eyes darted from face to face, and the horrific reality slowly began to dawn on him. There was not a single person from his church in attendance. I had not invited them. Instead, Calvin locked eyes with the governor of the state. Vivian nearly choked on her breath when she recognized a billionaire tech CEO standing near the grand staircase. Preston began to sweat profusely, his eyes darting frantically toward a group of men by the courtyard doors. He recognized 2 federal judges and the district's lead prosecuting attorney. The room was not filled with easily manipulated churchgoers. It was packed with titans, lawmakers, and untouchable billionaires. Jasmine, however, was fundamentally incapable of reading the room. Her toxic narcissism blinded her to her own irrelevance. She smoothed her hands over her tight, inappropriate sequined dress, lifted her chin, and decided she was going to dominate the space. "Come on," Jasmine commanded loudly, her shrill voice slicing through the elegant murmur of the foyer. "The front row is reserved for immediate family. Let us go claim our VIP seats before they let the regular guests in." She marched forward with unearned authority, leading Calvin, Vivian, and Preston past the champagne towers and toward the grand double doors that opened out onto the spectacular oceanfront ceremony lawn. The lawn was a breathtaking vision of white silk runners, towering floral arches, and hundreds of lucite chairs facing the sparkling blue water. Jasmine strutted directly toward the front row, fully intending to place herself right beside the altar to ensure she was in every single photograph. "Excuse me." The voice was soft, melodic, and completely terrifying. A woman stepped smoothly into Jasmine's path, effectively blocking her advance. It was Genevieve Loretta's fiercely protective, world-renowned wedding planner. Genevieve wore a flawless tailored charcoal suit, her silver hair pulled back into a severe chignon. She held an iPad against her chest and looked at Jasmine with an expression of mild clinical distaste, as if she had just stepped in something unpleasant on the sidewalk. "Can I help you?" Genevieve asked, her tone entirely devoid of warmth. Jasmine scoffed, rolling her eyes and attempting to step around the woman. "I am the bride's sister. I am the maid of honor. Move aside. We need to take our seats in the front row." Genevieve did not move a single inch. She tapped the screen of her iPad, her eyes flicking up to assess Jasmine's flashy, inappropriate dress with a micro-expression of pure judgment. "You are certainly not the maid of honor," Genevieve stated, her voice slicing through Jasmine's arrogance like a surgical scalpel. "The maid of honor is currently upstairs in the master bridal suite with Miss Hughes. Your party is listed strictly under general seating." Vivian stepped forward, her face flushing a deep, angry red. "Listen here. We are the immediate family. Her father is the pastor who should be officiating this wedding. We belong in the front row." Genevieve looked at Vivian, entirely unmoved by her demands. "You are the Calvin party, correct?" "Yes," Calvin boomed, crossing his arms to project his size. "Excellent," Genevieve said, turning smoothly to a towering, broad-shouldered usher standing nearby. "Please escort the Calvin party to their assigned table." Jasmine smirked, assuming they had won. She tossed her hair and followed the usher, expecting to be led to the plush silk-draped chairs at the very front of the aisle. But the usher did not stop at the first row. He kept walking. Calvin, Vivian, Jasmine, and Preston followed him past the front section reserved for the Hughes family. They walked past the second row where the federal judges were seated. They walked past the third, fourth, and fifth rows. The smug smiles on their faces began to falter as they were marched further and further back into the sea of guests. They walked past the middle section. They walked past the rear section. The usher led them entirely off the pristine main lawn, guiding them onto a narrow paved side patio that was completely separated from the central celebration. The usher finally stopped and gestured politely to their assigned seats. Table 28. It was not a plush silk-draped chair. It was a tiny, cramped, wobbly, high-top table covered in a basic white linen cloth. It was positioned in the absolute furthest, darkest corner of the estate. To their immediate left were the heavy, swinging metal doors of the catering kitchen, where waiters rushed in and out carrying massive trays of food. To their immediate right was the hallway leading directly to the guest restrooms. Jasmine stared at the wobbly table, her mouth opening and closing in silent horror. Vivian clutched her faux pearls, her face draining of all color. Calvin stood frozen, his grand threats of boycotts and public humiliation completely neutralizing in his throat. They had come to the lion's den expecting to mock a stray cat. Instead, they had been ruthlessly publicly downgraded to the absolute bottom of the food chain, seated next to the restrooms, forced to watch my ultimate triumph from the absolute farthest edge of relevance. The string quartet seamlessly transitioned from a delicate Vivaldi concerto to a swelling custom-arranged bridal march, the sound carrying beautifully over the rhythmic crash of the Pacific Ocean against the cliffs below. The guests rose in unison, a synchronized movement of the city's most powerful figures. Federal judges, tech titans, and political elites turned their attention toward the grand double doors of the estate. I stood at the top of the white silk runner, my arm looped securely through Silas's. He beamed down at me, his chest puffed out with undeniable fierce paternal pride. I wore a custom hand-beaded gown that cascaded into a cathedral-length train, a masterpiece of design that felt weightless against the gentle coastal breeze. As we began our slow descent down the aisle, I did not look at the back row. I did not look toward the dark corner by the catering kitchen, where my biological family had been banished. My eyes were locked entirely on the altar, where Julian stood waiting for me. He looked breathtaking in a bespoke midnight blue tuxedo, his posture radiating absolute authority and profound, unwavering devotion. From her humiliating vantage point at table 28, Vivian was practically vibrating with toxic, uncontainable rage. The heavy swinging metal doors of the catering kitchen kept bumping against the back of her chair as waiters rushed out with trays of hors d'oeuvres. The scent of imported white orchids was entirely overpowered by the smell of roasting garlic and industrial dish soap. She was completely boxed in, surrounded by the mechanical operations of the event, rather than the glamorous spectacle she felt entitled to dominate. Vivian watched through the gaps in the crowd as Silas walked me down the aisle. Her narcissistic mind simply could not process the reality of her irrelevance. She was the mother. She was the matriarch. She belonged at the front draped in expensive fabrics, receiving the adoration and congratulations of the billionaires seated in the front rows. The sheer indignity of being hidden away like an embarrassing secret caused something inside her fragile, ego-driven psyche to snap. As the officiant began to speak, his voice echoing smoothly through the discreetly placed surround sound speakers, Vivian made her decision. She was not going to sit in the shadows. She was going to stand up, march right down the center of that white silk runner, and interrupt the entire ceremony. She planned to throw a spectacular manufactured fit of weeping hysteria, screaming about how she had been alienated from her beloved daughter, forcing the entire congregation of elites to look at her, to pity her, to center her in my narrative. Vivian planted her hands on the wobbly high-top table and braced her legs to stand. She did not even make it 1 inch out of her chair. Before Vivian could straighten her knees, let alone open her mouth to scream, 2 massive shadows materialized from the alcove directly behind her. They were elite private security contractors, men who moved with the lethal, silent efficiency of apex predators. Without a single word, they stepped up directly behind Vivian's chair. 2 heavy, uncompromising hands clamped down on Vivian's shoulders with the force of an industrial vice. The grip was agonizingly firm, driving her instantly and forcefully back down into her seat. Vivian gasped, her eyes going wide with shock. She tried to twist around, tried to open her mouth to yell for Calvin, but one of the guards leaned down, bringing his face dangerously close to her ear. "Do not make a sound," the guard whispered, his voice a chilling mechanical rasp completely devoid of humanity. "You will remain seated, you will remain silent, and you will keep your hands in your lap for the duration of this ceremony. If you attempt to stand again, you will be physically removed from this property and handed over to the local authorities for trespassing. Do you understand?" Vivian was completely paralyzed. The sheer, overwhelming physical intimidation drained every ounce of arrogant rebellion from her body. She looked frantically at Calvin, but my biological father was staring straight ahead, his jaw clenched, absolutely terrified to intervene. Preston was trembling in his seat, and Jasmine was pretending not to notice. Vivian swallowed hard, the fight completely knocked out of her, and gave a stiff, terrified nod. The guards did not step away. They remained stationed directly behind her chair, their hands hovering just inches from her shoulders, acting as a permanent, terrifying blockade for the remainder of the ceremony. At the altar, completely insulated from the pathetic scuffle in the back corner, I took Julian's hands. The officiant's words washed over us, but the only thing that mattered was the intense, unbreakable connection anchoring us together. When it was time for our vows, Julian did not read from a piece of paper. He looked directly into my soul. "Kendra, you are the most formidable force I have ever encountered," Julian said, his voice carrying a quiet, resonant power that captivated the entire lawn. "You built an empire from the ground up, demanding respect in rooms designed to keep you out. You have survived every storm meant to break you, and you emerged flawless. I do not promise to save you because you do not need saving. I promise to stand beside you as your equal. I promise to fiercely protect the life we are building, to ruthlessly eliminate any obstacle in our path, and to love you with an intensity that will echo through generations. You are my partner, my equal, and my absolute sovereign." Tears pricked my eyes, completely unscripted and entirely genuine. I squeezed his hands, my voice clear and unwavering as I spoke my truth to the man who had seen every jagged edge of my past and chosen to sharpen them into weapons. "Julian, you saw the survivor in me and treated her like a queen," I replied, smiling, as his thumb gently brushed against my knuckles. "You never asked me to shrink, to accommodate your ego. You handed me the crown and asked me what we were conquering next. I promised to match your loyalty with unyielding devotion. I promised to be the architect of our legacy, to stand back to back with you against any threat, and to build a future so brilliant it blinds anyone who ever doubted us. You are my sanctuary and my greatest victory." The officiant pronounced us husband and wife. Julian pulled me in his kiss, sealing a partnership forged in absolute impenetrable power. The crowd erupted into thunderous, dignified applause. Silas and Loretta were beaming from the front row, leading the standing ovation as Julian and I turned and walked back up the aisle completely victorious. As we glided past the sea of cheering elites, I allowed myself one brief fleeting glance toward the back corner. Vivian was pinned to her chair, her face a mask of defeated horror, guarded by two towering men in black suits. I did not break my stride. I simply smiled, turning my attention back to my husband. The transition to the cocktail hour was a masterpiece of luxury event execution. The guests moved from the ceremony lawn to the expansive manicured upper terraces. Waiters circulated with silver platters of seared Wagyu truffle blinis and glasses of Dom Perignon. A jazz band played a smooth, upbeat set near the reflecting pool, and the air buzzed with the quiet networking of billionaires and power brokers. Jasmine, however, was rapidly spiraling into a completely unhinged state of toxic envy. She stood near the edge of the terrace, physically shaking, as she downed her fourth consecutive glass of champagne. The cheap sequins of her inappropriate dress scratched against the stone balustrade as she gripped it. Her eyes locked obsessively on me. I was standing near the center of the terrace, effortlessly mingling with a federal appellate judge and the CEO of a major tech conglomerate, my laughter ringing out clear and joyful. Jasmine could not handle it. Her entire identity was built on the delusion that she was superior to me, that she had secured the ultimate prize by marrying a wealthy white man from a prominent family. But looking around the terrace, the illusion was completely shattered. The women here were wearing understated custom couture, draped in genuine heirloom diamonds that made Jasmine's heavily financed engagement ring look like costume jewelry. They were discussing global philanthropic initiatives, not desperate country club gossip. Preston was faring even worse. He was sweating right through his suit jacket, his eyes darting frantically around the terrace like a cornered rat. He had just spotted Julian standing by the outdoor bar, casually sharing a drink with the district's lead prosecuting attorney. The very men who were actively building the federal indictment against Preston's fraudulent syndicate were laughing together, completely relaxed, while Preston stood 20 feet away, drowning in the terrifying realization that his arrest was imminent. "Preston, we need to leave," Preston hissed, grabbing Jasmine's arm and attempting to pull her toward the valet exit. "We cannot be here. Do you see who he is talking to? We have to go right now." Jasmine viciously yanked her arm out of his grasp, nearly spilling her champagne. "Are you out of your mind?" Jasmine slurred, her eyes wild with alcohol and desperate manic ambition. "We are not going anywhere. Do you have any idea how much money is on this terrace right now? Look around you, Preston. These people are billionaires. They throw away $500,000 on bad investments before breakfast." Preston shook his head, his breathing shallow and rapid. "You do not understand. That lawyer Julian is the prosecutor investigating my firm. If he sees me here, if he talks to those judges, it is over." Jasmine scoffed, stepping closer to her husband, her breath reeking of expensive alcohol and cheap desperation. "Exactly," she hissed, her eyes gleaming with a malicious, terrifyingly delusional light. "He thinks he has you cornered. Kendra thinks she has won. They think they can just shove us in the back by the bathrooms and forget about us. But they forgot who I am." She grabbed Preston by the lapels of his sweat-stained jacket, pulling him down to her eye level. "I am not leaving here until we get the money to save your firm," Jasmine whispered, her voice dropping to a frantic, venomous pitch. "And Kendra is going to give us the platform to do it. When they move everyone into the ballroom for the reception, there will be speeches, the best man, the father of the groom, all of them will take the stage." Preston stared at her, genuine horror dawning on his face. "Jasmine, no. What are you planning?" Jasmine smiled, a crooked, ugly expression of pure spite. "When the speeches start, I am going to rush the stage," Jasmine instructed, her grip tightening on his lapels. "I am her biological sister. No one is going to stop me from giving a heartfelt sisterly toast. And once I have that microphone, I am not giving it back. I am going to announce your new massive business venture to the entire room. I am going to pitch your syndicate directly to a captive audience of billionaires. I will hijack her entire moment, completely steal the spotlight, and force these rich fools to pay attention to us. All we need is one of them to bite Preston. Just one arrogant billionaire wanting to get in on a ground floor opportunity, and your debts are paid. We can save the firm tonight and absolutely humiliate Kendra in the process. The grand ballroom of the Hughes estate was a masterclass in immersive luxury. As the evening progressed, the space transformed into a glowing golden sanctuary. Thousands of suspended floating candles cast a warm, starlit glow over the 300 elite guests seated at long mirrored tables. The scent of roasted prime rib and white truffles wafted through the air, mingling with the soft melodic notes of a 12-piece jazz ensemble. Julian and I sat at the center of the room at a raised sweetheart table flanked by cascading walls of white roses, looking out over a sea of industry titans, federal judges, and international diplomats. It was a room overflowing with undeniable generational power. And in the absolute furthest, darkest corner of that room, banished behind a massive floral pillar and situated uncomfortably close to the kitchen's swinging service doors, sat table 28. Jasmine was vibrating with a toxic alcohol-fueled manic energy. The dinner service was concluding, and the jazz ensemble slowly faded their music to a soft, ambient hum. The estate's masterful event coordinator glided to the center of the room, tapping a silver spoon against a crystal flute. It was time for the evening's toasts. From my vantage point at the sweetheart table, I had a clear, unobstructed view of the entire ballroom. I watched as Jasmine sharply turned her head, locking eyes with our mother. Vivian gave her a single aggressive nod. It was the signal. Jasmine stood up so quickly, her chair scraped loudly against the polished marble floor. She grabbed Preston by the wrist, her manicured nails digging into his suit jacket, dragging her visibly terrified husband out of his seat. Vivian followed closely behind them, her face set in a mask of rigid, arrogant determination. They began to aggressively push their way through the tightly packed tables, completely disregarding the unspoken rules of high society etiquette. Jasmine shoved past a federal appellate judge, her cheap sequined dress snagging briefly on the back of his chair. She bumped into the wife of a tech billionaire, unapologetically stepping on the hem of the woman's custom couture gown without offering a single word of apology. She was entirely consumed by her own desperate delusion. In her mind, she was about to seize the microphone command, the attention of 300 billionaires, and deliver a pitch for Preston's fraudulent syndicate that would magically save them from federal prison and financial ruin. She believed she was about to hijack my wedding and emerge as the ultimate victor. Julian, sitting calmly beside me, did not miss a single detail. His dark eyes tracked Jasmine's frantic, undignified march across the ballroom. He did not tense. He did not rise from his seat or raise his voice. He simply lifted his right hand, resting it casually on the table, and made a singular, subtle micro-gesture with his index finger toward the shadows near the grand stage. The estate's chief sound engineer, stationed behind a massive state-of-the-art mixing board, completely concealed by floral arrangements, saw the signal. He reached down and adjusted a single slider. Jasmine reached the stage just as the event coordinator stepped away. She did not wait to be introduced. She did not wait for an invitation. She simply hoisted herself up the 3 carpeted steps, her inappropriate champagne-colored gown flashing under the stage lights, and marched directly to the center floor. She grabbed the primary microphone stand with both hands, ripping the microphone out of its cradle with a triumphant, arrogant smirk. Preston stood frozen at the base of the stairs, sweating profusely, while Vivian stood beside him, her chin raised high proudly, waiting for her golden child to humiliate me. Jasmine brought the microphone to her lips, inhaling deeply to project her voice across the massive, cavernous ballroom. "Excuse me, everyone. If you could all direct your attention to me," Jasmine shouted into the microphone. But there was no booming echo. There was no amplification. The audio had been completely surgically severed. Her raw, unamplified voice barely carried past the first 2 tables. The heavy acoustics of the massive ballroom swallowed her words instantly. Jasmine blinked, confused. She pulled the microphone away from her face, staring at it for a second before bringing it back to her mouth and practically screaming into the metal mesh. I said, "Excuse me, I am the bride's sister," Jasmine yelled, her voice straining and cracking. Still nothing but dead empty air. The microphone was entirely dead. Panic began to shatter her arrogant facade. She aggressively tapped the top of the microphone with her palm. The dull, hollow thud of flesh hitting metal was barely audible. She blew into it frantically. She smacked the side of it. She looked like an absolute unhinged fool, standing in the center of a brightly lit stage, violently wrestling with a dead piece of audio equipment. The 300 elite guests in the ballroom stopped their quiet conversations and turned to stare at her. They did not look at her with awe or respect. They looked at her with profound, overwhelming, second-hand embarrassment. A state senator sitting in the front row leaned over and whispered something to his wife, both of them staring at Jasmine with expressions of mild, clinical disgust. The silence in the room grew heavy, thick with the collective judgment of the city's most powerful people, watching a desperate woman make a complete spectacle of herself. Vivian, realizing the profound humiliation unfolding frantically, waved her hands from the bottom of the stairs, hissing at Jasmine to speak louder. Jasmine tried again, raising her voice to a shrill, screeching pitch, attempting to project over the massive space without any technological aid. "My husband Preston has a massive ground-floor commercial syndicate," Jasmine shrieked, her voice completely lost in the sheer scale of the room. "It is a high-yield, generational wealth opportunity." She looked absolutely deranged. She was pitching a fraudulent real estate scam to a room full of billionaires, using her bare vocal cords, looking like a desperate street corner solicitor who had somehow wandered into a royal gala. Before Jasmine could damage her vocal cords any further, a towering, impeccably tailored figure glided smoothly up the stairs on the completely opposite side of the grand stage. Silas Hughes stepped into the spotlight. He did not look angry. He did not look flustered. He radiated the kind of quiet, absolute authority that only comes from a lifetime of unchallenged power. He held a secondary, fully operational microphone in his right hand. The moment Silas reached the center of the stage, the entire ballroom fell into a dead, reverent silence. The elite guests, who had just been staring at Jasmine with profound distaste, immediately shifted their attention, their posture straightening out of sheer, unadulterated respect for the patriarch of the Hughes empire. Jasmine stood paralyzed just 5 feet away from him, gripping her dead microphone, her face flushing a dark, blotchy red as the reality of her total failure washed over her. 2 massive suited security guards silently materialized from the wings of the stage. They did not cause a scene. They simply stepped up to Jasmine, placed firm hands on her elbows, and physically guided her off the stage, marching her and Vivian back toward the dark, isolated misery of Table 28. Silas did not even watch them leave. He looked out over the sea of guests, his eyes warm and commanding, before locking his gaze directly onto me. When Silas spoke, his rich baritone voice rolled through the state-of-the-art sound system, wrapping the entire ballroom in a blanket of commanding warmth. "Family is a word that gets thrown around quite casually in our society," Silas began, his voice echoing with absolute clarity. "Many people believe that family is simply a matter of biology. They believe that sharing a bloodline automatically entitles them to respect, to access, and to loyalty. But Loretta and I learned a long time ago that blood is merely an accident of birth. True family is a conscious, daily choice." The room was completely captivated. Every single eye was locked on Silas. For years, my wife and I sat in our home surrounded by every material success a person could ever ask for. Silas continued, his voice softening with genuine, profound emotion. "We built an empire, but our halls were entirely too quiet. We had power, but we lacked the one thing that gives power its actual purpose. We lacked a legacy built on love. And then a force of nature walked into our lives." Silas smiled, raising his free hand to gesture toward the sweetheart table. "Kendra and my grandson Malik did not just walk into our firm. They walked into our hearts," Silas said, tears visibly shining in his dark eyes. "Kendra showed us what true resilience looks like. She showed us what it means to protect the people you love with a fierce, uncompromising loyalty. She and Malik saved Loretta and me from a quiet, lonely life. They filled our halls with laughter, with joy, and with a brilliant, undeniable light. They taught us that the family you choose is always infinitely stronger than the family you inherit. There was not a dry eye in the room. Loretta was dabbing her cheeks with a silk handkerchief from her seat in the front row. Julian reached under the table, his hand wrapping tightly around mine, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped down my own cheek. It was the most beautiful, validating declaration of love I had ever received. Silas took a slow, deep breath, letting the emotional weight of his words settle over the silent, captivated ballroom. His warm, fatherly expression slowly hardened, transitioning into the sharp, lethal focus of a corporate titan preparing to execute a flawless maneuver. Silas reached inside the breast pocket of his bespoke tuxedo. He pulled out a thick, legally binding document, the premium parchment paper crisp and white under the stage lights. He unfolded it deliberately, smoothing the creases with one hand. Silas lifted his head, his gaze shifting away from me, bypassing the billionaires and the federal judges in the front rows. His eyes tracked all the way to the back of the room, piercing through the shadows and locking with absolute, terrifying precision directly onto Calvin, who was sitting frozen and humiliated at table 28. And today, Silas announced, his voice dropping to a low, devastating register that sent a shiver down my spine. I have one more announcement to make. Silas stood at the center of the grand stage, the magnificent crystal chandeliers casting a warm golden halo around him. The ballroom was so entirely silent that the faint rhythmic sound of the ocean waves crashing against the cliffs outside could be heard through the thick glass of the terrace doors. He held the heavy cream-colored parchment in his right hand, his thumb brushing over the raised gold seal of the federal court. His eyes remained locked onto the dark, miserable corner of the room where my biological family was seated. Table 28 was practically swallowed by the shadows, but Silas's piercing gaze illuminated their pathetic existence for exactly what it was. For decades, Loretta and I have aggressively expanded the Hughes empire. Silas continued, his voice ringing with absolute, uncompromising authority. We have built commercial developments, secured international supply chains, and established philanthropic foundations that will outlast us both. But an empire without a worthy successor is simply a monument waiting to crumble. We refuse to hand our life's work over to a board of directors who only care about quarterly profit margins. We demanded a successor who understood the value of loyalty, the absolute necessity of resilience, and the power of unapologetic integrity. Silas slowly swept his gaze away from Calvin, looking out over the sea of 300 elite guests. He looked at the federal judges, the state senators, and the titans of industry who had respected him for a lifetime. We demanded a titan, Silas said softly, yet the words struck the room like a thunderclap. And we found one. He lifted the document, unfolding it with a crisp, deliberate snap of the heavy paper. Yesterday morning, in the chambers of the federal courthouse, Loretta and I signed the final irrevocable document. Silas announced, his voice rising, vibrating with immense, chest-swelling pride. We did not merely sign an employment contract. We signed a certificate of adult adoption. The woman sitting at the sweetheart table tonight is no longer just my brilliant chief counsel. She is my blood in every way that truly matters. The room seemed to hold its breath collectively. I sat frozen beside Julian, my heart pounding against my ribs, utterly overwhelmed by the magnitude of the love radiating from the stage. Julian's hand tightened around mine, anchoring me to the present, his dark eyes shining with fierce pride. It is my greatest honor to formally introduce to you the newest member of our family, Silas declared, projecting his voice to the very back walls of the cavernous ballroom. Kendra Hughes. She is my legally adopted daughter. As of this morning, she has been unanimously ratified by the board of directors as the CEO in waiting of Hughes Holdings. And upon my retirement, she will be the sole uncontested heir to the entirety of our $400 million estate. The physical reaction from table 28 was immediate, violent, and viscerally devastating. Jasmine's hand went entirely slack. The crystal champagne flute she had been gripping like a lifeline slipped through her manicured fingers. It hit the polished marble floor with a sharp, explosive shatter, the expensive champagne splashing across the hem of her inappropriate sequined dress and seeping into the expensive carpet. She did not even look down. Her jaw had unhinged, her mouth hanging open in a grotesque mask of sheer paralyzing horror. Her eyes were blown wide, entirely consumed by a cognitive dissonance so massive it was actively fracturing her reality. Beside her, Preston went the color of wet ash. The arrogant, sweaty swagger completely evaporated from his body, replaced by the terrifying, suffocating realization of his own impending doom. He fell back into his wobbly chair, his hands gripping the edge of the table as he began to hyperventilate. The man he had just attempted to pitch a fraudulent Ponzi scheme to was not just a successful lawyer. Julian was the lead special prosecutor for the SEC, and he was marrying the sole heiress to a $400 million empire. Preston had not just walked into a trap, he had willingly locked himself inside a federal prison cell and handed us the key. He grabbed his chest, his eyes darting frantically toward the exit doors, physically sick with terror. Calvin and Vivian sat frozen as if they had been turned to stone. The air completely left Calvin's lungs. The man who had cornered me in a private room just 24 hours earlier, screaming demands for a $500,000 bailout and threatening to boycott my wedding to humiliate me, was now staring at the absolute annihilation of his leverage. His entire congregation, his social standing, his booming pulpit voice, all of it was rendered completely microscopic. He had threatened to embarrass me in front of Julian's family, only to discover that I was now the legal owner of a dynasty that could buy and sell his entire church 1,000 times over without noticing the expense. Vivian looked as though she was actively suffocating. Her hands flew to her throat, clawing at her faux pearls. As she stared at me, sitting at the sweetheart table, draped in custom couture and surrounded by white roses. Her golden child, Jasmine, the daughter she had sacrificed my college fund for, the daughter who was supposed to elevate their bloodline by marrying a mediocre white con artist, was currently sitting next to the bathrooms, covered in spilled champagne. Meanwhile, the daughter she had discarded, abused, and labeled a permanent disappointment was being crowned a queen in front of the most powerful people in the state. The ballroom erupted. It did not start as polite applause. It started as a massive, unified roar of approval. 300 of the most influential, wealthy, and powerful figures in the city rose to their feet in a spontaneous, breathtaking standing ovation. The federal appellate judge stood up, clapping his hands above his head. The tech billionaires whistled and cheered. The sheer volume of the applause was deafening, a physical wall of sound that vibrated through the floorboards and echoed off the vaulted ceilings. Julian stood up, pulling me gently to my feet. He wrapped his arms around me, kissing me deeply as the crowd cheered louder. Silas stepped down from the stage, handing the microphone to the event coordinator, and pulled me into a massive bear-hugging embrace, followed immediately by Loretta, who wrapped her arms around my neck, whispering how proud she was into my ear. I looked out over the sea of standing, clapping guests. The love, the respect, and the absolute security of my new reality washed over me, completely cleansing my soul of any lingering childhood trauma. I was Kendra Hughes. I was untouchable. But from the dark, isolated corner by the kitchen doors, the standing ovation was the final fatal blow to a very fragile mind. Jasmine stood amidst the deafening cheers, staring at the shattered glass around her feet. The noise of the wealthy elite clapping for me beat against her eardrums like a physical assault. Her entire worldview, the absolute core of her narcissistic identity, was entirely predicated on the belief that she was better than me. She was the beautiful one. She was the one who married well. She was the one who belonged in high society. To see me standing at the center of the room, loved wealthy beyond her wildest, sickest comprehension, and accepted by the very elite circle she had bankrupted herself trying to emulate, was too much. Her brain simply refused to process the reality of her defeat. Something inside Jasmine permanently snapped. Her hands began to twitch at her sides. Her breathing became ragged, animalistic gasps. She muttered to herself, her eyes darting frantically around the room, wildly searching for a way to rewrite the narrative, a way to drag me back down to the dirt where she believed I belonged. She could not accept the loss. She could not accept the sheer magnitude of my elevation. If she could not outshine me, if she could not steal my microphone, then she was going to have to physically destroy me. The event coordinator smoothly transitioned the evening, inviting the guests to take their seats as the catering staff began pouring champagne for the formal toasts. Julian leaned in, pressing a kiss to my cheek, and whispered that he was going to go speak with the lead prosecuting attorney for a brief moment about securing a federal warrant for Preston first thing Monday morning. I smiled, kissing him back, and told him I was going to run to the bridal suite to have my seamstress bustle my cathedral train before our first dance. I stepped away from the sweetheart table, completely unaware of the psychotic break unfolding at table 28. As I disappeared down the warmly lit carpeted hallway leading toward the private master suites, Jasmine's head snapped in my direction. Her eyes dilated completely, devoid of any rational thought. Jasmine shoved her chair backward with such force it tipped over and crashed onto the marble floor. Vivian reached out frantically, grabbing at her daughter's arm, but Jasmine violently yanked herself free. She stomped directly over the shattered glass of her champagne flute, her cheap heels crunching against the crystal. She shoved past a waiter carrying a tray of empty plates, nearly knocking him off balance. She ignored the confused, disgusted looks of the guests seated near the back. She was entirely consumed by a blinding, suffocating rage. She marched toward the hallway, her hands curled into tight, trembling fists, her eyes locked onto the door of the private bridal suite. She had lost her money. She had lost her status. She had lost her mind. And now she was going to make me pay for it. The master bridal suite was an oasis of absolute tranquility, providing a sharp, luxurious contrast to the roaring celebration echoing through the main ballroom downstairs. I stood in the center of the room on a circular velvet pedestal, while Genevieve Loretta's flawless event coordinator and two highly skilled seamstresses worked with practiced precision to bustle the cathedral-length train of my custom gown. The room smelled faintly of fresh eucalyptus and expensive perfume. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the magnitude of Silas's public announcement settle deep into my bones. For the first time in my entire life, I felt completely, legally, and permanently untouchable. I was no longer the discarded, struggling single mother they had banished to the shadows. I was Kendra Hughes, the sole heir to an empire. That peaceful tranquility shattered violently. The heavy mahogany door to the suite did not just open. It was thrown back with such aggressive force that the brass handle slammed loudly into the custom silk wallpaper. Jasmine stood in the doorway, a terrifying, pathetic vision of unhinged alcohol-fueled desperation. Her inappropriate champagne-colored gown was stained with spilled liquor and snagged at the hem. Her meticulously styled hair was unraveling strands sticking to her sweat-slicked forehead. She breathed in heavy, ragged gasps, her eyes completely wild and fully dilated as they locked onto me. Genevieve immediately stepped in front of me, her posture rigid and defensive, signaling for the security team waiting in the hallway, but I raised a hand and gently placed it on her shoulder. I stepped down from the velvet pedestal, my heavy silk gown rustling softly against the plush carpet. I looked at the woman who shared my biology, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold clinical detachment. Jasmine marched forward, her cheap heels sinking heavily into the expensive carpet. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face, her chest heaving with toxic, uncontainable envy. "It is not fair!" Jasmine screamed, her voice cracking with hysterical rage, the sound bouncing harshly off the mirrored walls. "None of this is fair. You do not deserve this. You do not deserve $400 million. You are nothing. You are supposed to be nothing." I simply stared at her, entirely unmoved by her erratic, desperate display. Jasmine closed the distance between us, her toxic delusion pouring out of her mouth like poison. "You are going to share it with us," she demanded, her tone shifting from a scream to a frantic, commanding hiss. "You owe us. We are your immediate family. We are your real blood. You are going to sign over whatever Preston needs to save his firm, and you are going to do it tonight. Do you understand me?" Before I could even formulate a response to her breathtaking audacity, another figure stumbled blindly through the doorway. Preston burst into the suite completely out of breath and physically shaking. He looked like a man walking directly to the gallows. His face was a sickly, translucent shade of gray, and his suit jacket was thoroughly soaked with nervous perspiration. He lunged forward, grabbing Jasmine tightly by the arm and attempting to drag her backward toward the hallway. "Jasmine, shut up." Preston begged, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched whine of pure terror. "Stop talking right now. We need to leave. We need to run." Jasmine violently ripped her arm out of his grip, spinning around to shove his chest. "Stop being a coward," she shrieked, completely blinded by her own unearned arrogance. "She has the money, Preston. She is the heir. She can write a single check and make the federal investigators go away. She has to do it. We are her blood." The air in the room suddenly turned to ice. A tall, impeccably tailored shadow fell across the doorway. Julian stepped into the bridal suite, exuding a quiet, lethal composure that instantly drained the remaining oxygen from the space. He did not look angry. He did not raise his voice. He moved with the terrifying, calculated precision of an apex predator who had finally cornered his prey. In his right hand, he held a sleek black leather briefcase. Preston saw him and physically recoiled. His knees visibly buckled and he backed up against the suite's marble vanity, his breathing turning into rapid, shallow pants. Julian ignored Jasmine entirely. He did not even glance in her direction. His dark, unwavering gaze was locked entirely on Preston. The silence in the room stretched out heavy and suffocating, broken only by Jasmine's erratic breathing and Preston's terrified whimpering. Julian unclasped the leather briefcase with a sharp, metallic click that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. He reached inside and pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. He walked slowly across the carpet and stopped directly in front of the trembling man. He held the folder out. Preston stared at it as if it were a live explosive, his hands shaking so violently he could barely raise them to accept the file. Julian did not offer a polite smile. "What you are holding is a courtesy copy," Julian stated, his voice a smooth, uncompromising wall of federal authority. The official federal indictment was signed and finalized by a federal judge at 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon. You are being charged with 47 counts of wire fraud, securities fraud, and money laundering. Your real estate syndicate is not a business, Preston. It is a documented textbook Ponzi scheme, and we have tracked every single stolen dollar across 3 different shell accounts. Jasmine froze, her mouth opening and closing in silent shock as Julian's words finally penetrated her alcohol-soaked brain. The arrogant fire in her eyes flickered and died, replaced by a creeping icy dread. "But the prosecution is not the only problem you have." Julian continued, leaning in slightly, his tone dropping to a conversational, deadly whisper. "You see, Preston, 3 months ago, you desperately pitched your fraud to an anonymous whale investor out of Chicago. You took $5 million of their capital to cover the immediate debts of your earlier investors, thinking you had secured a brilliant lifeline to keep your scam afloat." Preston swallowed hard, a whimpering, pathetic sound escaping his throat. "You never checked the corporate structuring of that Chicago firm," Julian said, tilting his head with a look of absolute clinical pity. "If you had done your due diligence, you would have realized it was a subsidiary shell company owned entirely by Silas Hughes. You did not just run a Ponzi scheme. You actively and unknowingly stole $5 million directly from my father-in-law. And Silas Hughes does not forgive a theft. He orchestrated that investment specifically to trap you, and you walked right into it." Preston's legs completely gave out. He slid down the front of the vanity mirror, collapsing into a pathetic weeping heap on the carpet. He clutched the heavy federal indictment to his chest, sobbing uncontrollably into his knees. He knew exactly what this meant. There was no bailout. There was no negotiation. There was only absolute, inescapable generational ruin. Julian looked down at him, entirely unaffected by the display of misery. "The FBI will be waiting on your front lawn at 6 o'clock on Monday morning," Julian instructed smoothly, turning away from the trembling man and walking over to stand beside me. I strongly suggest you spend tomorrow getting your affairs in order. Enjoy your weekend." Jasmine stood frozen in the center of the suite. The manic, greedy light completely vanished from her eyes, replaced by a hollow, vacant stare of total psychological annihilation. The delusion she had clung to her entire life was entirely dismantled in less than 60 seconds. The wealth was gone. The status was gone. The country club memberships, the luxury cars, the arrogant superiority over me, it was all completely wiped out. Her husband was going to a federal penitentiary for decades, and she was about to be left with absolutely nothing but massive legal debts and public disgrace. Her mind simply could not process the vertical drop from her imagined high society throne straight into the dirt. She looked at me, her lower lip trembling violently, waiting for me to show a sliver of sisterly pity, waiting for me to offer the grace she had never once extended to me when I was struggling to feed my son. I stepped forward. The heavy silk of my bridal gown gathered gracefully around my feet, the intricate beading catching the soft light of the chandelier. I raised my hands and slowly, deliberately adjusted the massive, flawless diamond necklace resting against my collarbone. I looked Jasmine dead in the eye, stripping away any remaining trace of shared history, familial guilt, or biological obligation. I let the silence stretch, forcing her to bask in the overwhelming, crushing reality of my power and her complete, utter irrelevance. "You told me a single mom did not fit your aesthetic," I said, my voice ringing with icy, absolute finality. "Well, a family of broke, fraudulent parasites does not fit mine. Try Uber." The silence in the bridal suite was absolute, heavy with the devastating weight of my final verdict. Jasmine's mouth hung open, but no sound came out. The furious, entitled monster that had stormed into the room just moments ago had been entirely eradicated, replaced by a hollow shell of a woman who finally understood she had lost everything. Julian did not wait for her to process the destruction of her life. He simply raised his right hand and snapped his fingers. The sharp, crisp sound cracked through the air like a whip. Instantly, the heavy mahogany doors swung wide open. The same elite security contractors who had pinned Vivian to her chair during the ceremony marched into the suite with ruthless military precision. They flanked Preston, grabbing him by the arms. He did not fight them. He let out a pathetic, high-pitched sob, his legs dragging uselessly across the thick carpet as they hauled his trembling, sweat-soaked frame out of the room. Jasmine, however, finally found her voice. As two massive guards stepped up to her, she began to thrash wildly. "No!" she shrieked, kicking her cheap sequined heels and wildly swinging her arms. "Get your hands off me! You cannot do this! I am her sister. I am family." The guards were entirely unfazed. They clamped their massive hands around her biceps, lifting her off the ground so her feet barely grazed the carpet, and forcefully marched her into the hallway. I followed them out, standing beside Julian at the top of the grand staircase, watching the ultimate humiliation unfold. Down in the grand foyer, Calvin and Vivian had already been rounded up. Vivian was clutching her faux pearls, her face pale with mortification, while Calvin puffed out his chest, attempting to command authority over the stone-faced security team. His booming pastoral voice echoed off the marble walls, threatening lawsuits and divine retribution. The moment they saw Jasmine being physically dragged down the stairs, screaming and crying, Calvin's bluster evaporated. The grand double doors to the ballroom had been deliberately left open. 300 of the most powerful people in the state, the federal judges, the billionaires, the prosecuting attorneys, stood in absolute silence watching my biological family being thrown out like common criminals. Vivian tried to hide her face behind her clutch, practically running toward the exit to escape the suffocating judgmental glares of the city's elite. The guards shoved them through the heavy front doors, forcing them out into the biting, damp coastal night air. When Calvin demanded his leased luxury sedan, the valet simply stared at him, informed him his vehicle had been towed from the private drive, and pointed toward the massive iron gates at the bottom of the 2-mile estate road. I stood on the balcony with my husband, watching my abusers walk away into the darkness, completely stripped of their dignity, their leverage, and their delusions. The execution of Preston's downfall was swift, brutal, and flawlessly televised. At exactly 6 o'clock on Monday morning, a fleet of black tactical SUVs swarmed the manicured lawn of Preston and Jasmine's heavily mortgaged suburban home. Federal agents wearing windbreakers battered down the front door. Local news helicopters circled overhead, broadcasting live footage of Preston being marched out of his house in handcuffs, weeping openly while wearing a pair of silk pajamas. The charges of wire fraud and money laundering made the front page of every major financial publication in the country. But the domino effect of his arrest did not stop with him. The federal investigators tracing the millions of stolen dollars followed a direct, undeniable paper trail right to Calvin's bank accounts. My biological father, the man who preached righteousness and demanded total submission from his congregation, had a massive, unforgivable secret. When the FBI audited his finances, they discovered that Calvin had been systematically embezzling donation funds from his own church to float Preston's failing Ponzi scheme. He had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from his devoted parishioners, using the offering plates just to keep up the appearance of a wealthy, successful dynasty. The scandal erupted with catastrophic force. The church board immediately convened an emergency session, publicly stripping Calvin of his deacon title and his pastoral credentials. The man who had terrorized me with his booming voice and absolute authority was reduced to a disgraced, publicly humiliated fraud facing his own impending federal charges. Vivian's perfectly curated country club life disintegrated overnight. Her wealthy friends blocked her numbers, her social invitations vanished, and she was forced to show her face in the discount grocery stores she had spent a lifetime mocking, keeping her head down to avoid the stares of the people she had once scammed. As for Jasmine, the federal government seized absolutely everything. The suburban house, the luxury cars, the frozen bank accounts, all of it was confiscated to pay restitution to the victims of Preston's scam. With her husband sitting in a federal penitentiary and her parents facing total financial ruin, Jasmine was violently shoved into the reality she had always believed she was too good for. She was evicted and forced to move into a cramped, dingy, one-bedroom apartment in a rundown neighborhood. The woman who had sneered at me for struggling as a single mother now spent her days standing behind a cash register at a massive fluorescent-lit retail store. She wore a scratchy polyester uniform, ringing up discounted merchandise for minimum wage, forced to endure the daily soul-crushing indignity of answering to managers she believed were beneath her, her feet aching and her pride completely annihilated. 3 years passed completely untethered from the toxic weight of my past. The air on the sweeping back patio of the Hughes estate was warm and golden, filled with the scent of blooming jasmine and the distant rhythmic crash of the Pacific Ocean. I sat comfortably on a plush outdoor sofa, sipping a glass of iced chamomile tea. Beside me, Loretta rested a gentle hand over mine, her silver hair catching the late afternoon sunlight. We were laughing softly, watching the scene unfolding on the immaculate rolling green lawn. Malik was 7 years old now. He was a bright, joyful, and completely secure little boy, currently sprinting across the grass, with a baseball glove on his left hand. Julian and Silas stood a few yards away, taking turns throwing the baseball with him. Silas's booming, joyful laughter echoed across the property as Malik managed to catch a particularly difficult throw while Julian scooped the boy up, throwing him over his shoulder as they both cheered loudly. There was no tension on this patio. There was no conditional love. There was only absolute, unshakable peace and the quiet certainty of a life built on mutual respect. I took a deep breath, letting the warmth of the sun soak into my skin, watching my son smile without a single shadow of fear in his eyes. For so long I had let the rejection of my biological family define my worth. I had internalized their cruelty, believing that because the people who were supposed to love me had thrown me away, I was inherently flawed, inherently unworthy of being kept. I thought my struggle was a reflection of my value. But as I watched my husband, my son, and the man who had chosen to be my father, I finally understood the greatest truth of my life. Being discarded by them was not a punishment. It was a divine intervention. The universe had not abandoned me at that bus station all those years ago. It was simply forcibly removing the toxic, suffocating dead weight from my life to clear the path for my actual destiny. Rejection is rarely a reflection of your value. More often than not, it is the greatest protection you will ever receive. We are taught to bleed ourselves dry for the sake of bloodlines, to tolerate disrespect, manipulation, and abuse, simply because we share the same DNA. We are told to keep the peace at the expense of our own sanity. But blood does not demand loyalty, and biology is never an excuse for abuse. True family is not an accident of birth. It is a conscious daily choice made by people who respect your boundaries, celebrate your victories, and protect your peace. It is the people who stand by you when you have absolutely nothing to offer them but your truth. If you are sitting in the dark right now wondering why the people who are supposed to love you are constantly trying to break you, stop trying to fix them. Stop trying to prove your worth to people who are entirely committed to misunderstanding you. You owe absolutely nothing to those who use your pain as a stepping stone for their own egos. Cut the cord. Walk away without a single ounce of guilt. Let them call you the villain in their delusional, fabricated narratives. Your peace is worth infinitely more than their approval. When they tell you that you do not fit their aesthetic, believe them. When they tell you there is no room for you at their table, do not pull up a chair and beg for scraps. Build your own table, build your own empire, and let them watch you feast from the outside. Rejection from toxic family members is rarely a punishment. It is the universe's ultimate protection. We are often conditioned to tolerate manipulation, abuse, and profound disrespect simply because of shared biology. But blood does not entitle anyone to your peace, your sanity, or your future. True family is a conscious choice built on unwavering respect, genuine support, and mutual growth. When people prove they are committed to misunderstanding and diminishing you, the most powerful thing you can do is walk away. If there are no seats left for you at their table, build your own empire instead. Subscribe to hear more stories of resilience and share this with someone who needs the courage to cut ties and reclaim their worth today.